Hey, welcome to another free course. This is the next course after the UI case study one that dropped recently, so it's really good if you watch them together. This is part of my mission to bring 90% of all my courses completely free to YouTube. People who got these courses when they were paid already got their first jobs and are successful in the industry. Now it's time for everyone else to catch up as well. Even though some of the courses have been done 3 to 4 years ago, the knowledge in there is still relevant and the foundations are still valid even today, or especially today. As always, when this video gets 1,000 likes and 300 comments from different people, not 300 comments from one person, I'm gonna release the next free course of the whole portfolio of courses that I launched. On another note, the only courses that are not going to be released for free are the web design courses, the Squareblack Blueprint, more on that later, and the boring UI course. However, all of the remaining ones will eventually, over the course of this year, hopefully one every month, be released here on this channel for you to learn and explore and be a designer in 2026. That's also because I have some positive news for a change. After a while of evaluating how AI is progressing and potentially is it ready to replace designers, I believe that design is done right, obviously, is probably one of the last things that's going to be replaced. So actually learning design right now is still valid, it's still relevant, and it's still a very good idea. However, it needs to be done smart. It's not really about learning the AI tools or being super fast in systemizing designs in Figma or whatever you use. It's more about actually knowing the fundamentals. So that's what I'm bringing to you. Exactly here and now. Now we're gonna go a little back in time to see the version of me from 4 years ago that was recording this course. Without further ado, let's jump right into it, and you're gonna learn how to present your work the right way. Hey, let's talk about how to present your work. But first, let's face the ugly truth. The average attention span of humans right now is at the level of a goldfish. It has dropped from 12 seconds to just 8 seconds in like the early 2000s, so it's probably even lower right now. I believe the next social network will probably create clips that are just 3 seconds long because that's gonna be the most that people can handle at a time. We're bombarded by stimuli all the time from every direction, and it's really important for you to stand out from the crowd and get noticed. We need constant stimulation, otherwise we feel bored. Most people can't watch a movie right now without reaching for their phone every now and then and checking something. The world has become a mess of forced multitasking to push those dopamine levels higher and higher, and we're addicted to it. In a world like this, you need to compete for the attention of recruiters or clients. Their minds, their brains are running on an autopilot-like filter to quickly filter out whether something is even worth their attention. Now, your portfolio, your projects, your case studies, your designs, and even your resume are all content, and that content is competing for attention in a very saturated industry, which means that basically what you do competes for attention against other portfolios, other resumes, other projects, and they are often quite similar. First impression is everything, because if you don't make a good first impression, chances are you'll end up in the maybe pile, and likely nobody will read the case study and even check it out fully. And most people from the maybe pile don't get selected to get the job, and they don't even get invited to an interview. This is why a good presentation of your design work is essential to stand out and to have a bigger chance of actually getting the job or getting the client. In this course, I'm gonna show you a couple of techniques that I used successfully to get clients, to get recruiters to be interested in what I do. These techniques will help your designs and your portfolios and your case studies look more interesting and actually increase your chances of people paying attention. We will focus on 3 main areas in this mini course. The first one is obvious. We're gonna be making some device mockups and presenting your actual design work in a beautiful, friendly way. But that's not all. Here is a secret on how you can truly stand out, because those design elements, those design mockups are pretty obvious. A lot of people do that. There are some things that you can do that are gonna make you instantly stand out because almost nobody does them yet. You can use the same visual principles to make other parts of your portfolio and your case study stand out as well. I want to cover a couple of areas in particular: low fidelity wireframes, sketches, and presenting data, both as tables, data tables, and charts and graphs. Because these things are often neglected, and while you have some nice mockups in your case study, you're often ending up with pretty generic and pretty boring or ugly looking additional elements, and they can still be presented in a way that's gonna capture the attention of people and captivate them enough to just reach out to you and offer you the job. These three things, combined with an engaging case study, are gonna make all the difference between getting invited to an interview or being outright rejected or landing in the maybe pile. Okay, let's start with the plan. Before you start adding nice gradients and soft shadows everywhere, we need to create a plan of action. While I believe your case study needs to be very consistent in terms of fonts, colors, and overall style, I also believe that each project needs to be actually created on its own, and it needs to be tailored to match the theme and the concept of the project. To make it easier, let's divide a typical case study into two main areas. One is a classic breakdown of what you did and why, and this is what I call the first-person perspective, because it's all about you. I did this, then I used research to get this idea, and then I modified that, and this is where we're at. There's also a third-person approach, like in video games, where you're just seeing somebody else do the stuff from behind their backs. And this third-person perspective is very interesting because it helps you create a story, and stories are really engaging. You just need to create a hero, and that hero can be a different designer or a user or a group of users, but it needs to follow a typical path of a hero. If you choose option 2, you need to create a persona. But let's not create like a typical templated, boring persona that most people do. This is not what we want here. You need to create a narrator, and you need to figure out how you want that narrator to tell the story of this case study and what happened and how you arrived at this beautiful final design. What you need to make this case study more interesting is a couple of photos of your narrator, and of course you need to have all the photos to be of the same person, because it's just gonna break the narrative if there's one person talking about something and then it's a completely different person, down the road. So you need to find a couple of photos. You can use a free stock photo site, or you can take your own photos or photos of some of your friends in a couple of different poses. And that's gonna come in handy for the storytelling part. And yes, for the first person approach, you can take photos of yourself. Just make sure that these photos are done in a way that can help you illustrate and drive the narrative. So you can be pointing at something, you can be thinking about something, or as I say, ideating, or you can just be doing anything. Like, let's say if you have some research elements that you need to reevaluate because you have no idea what they do, you can have a pose like this. You can use that avatar in combination with some classic comic book style speech bubbles or some modern quotes next to the avatar. Whatever you choose, it needs to be consistent with the product. Then simply use those photos along with the text to create the main narrative. So where you started, where you're going, what happened in the middle, and how you came up with some additional solutions or additional ideas for the project, and then you wrap up with the final solution and we're all happy. Because case studies have quite a lot of information and a lot of data, it's really good to plan your case study around that data with those elements. So just try to distribute them pretty evenly. You start with the first one that starts to tell the story, and then the last one is probably just almost at the end of the case study, and then you distribute the other 3 or 2 in the middle between the content sections and between all the elements that are the main areas of the case study. So if you have more than 5, you can create more of those personas or those avatars and just make it more interesting. Let it tell a story, not just have like a too long didn't read block of text. Now there is some photo psychology here to consider as well. If you want to capture more attention, you can have the person in the very first photo on the top of the case study or near the top of the case study look straight at the camera, just like this. because obviously then we're gonna focus on the eyes of that person, and that's gonna be a very strong emotional connection. Then you can use a simple prehistoric rule of having the avatar look to the side, because if somebody is looking to the side in any direction, we naturally follow their gaze. We want to know what they're looking at because it might be something dangerous, or it might be something scary, or it might be something useful to us. So you can use that rule to have that person look to the side, look at the text that they're saying, or at the communication that you want them to basically deliver. So you can place important information to the side, or if the person is pointing at it and looking at it, it's gonna be an even stronger impression. And heat map studies show that most of the attention is then placed not on the eyes and the face of the person, but on that text. So that basically drives this whole story forward and keeps people engaged and interested. Of course, having an avatar is just one way, one idea that you can use to make your case studies and portfolios more interesting. And it's really good to not have the same concept in all of your case studies, because then it's gonna make your portfolio look boring. But you can experiment, you can just use quotes, you can use larger titles, you can use a lot of different elements. But if you start with like a story-driven concept with those avatars and with some text and with some narrative, it's gonna instantly make it more interesting. And if you combine this with nice UI and nice mockups, you're gonna do really, really good. Some things have changed since 2021. And some of these things also relate to presenting your work. I talk more about that in the Squareblack Blueprint, which is my best work to date. And if you want to get it $10 off, there is a special coupon code in the description of this video that's only gonna be valid for a couple days. All of the extra annotation techniques and methods that I outline in that course are things like type framing, proper red square method, and a lot of the other ways that you can make your work shine, including using paper to show your process, because this is increasingly relevant. And let me quickly tell you why. There is a distrust among clients right now when you're delivering work to them. It's more with developers, but it's beginning to happen with designers as well. The distrust comes from the fact that the clients can imagine that all you're actually doing is typing some prompt into a box and then you get the design, which means that perceived work that you're doing is much lower, even though you're likely not doing that, right? So the best way to avoid that is to show more of your process, to show more of your annotations, paper sketches, explorations, and ideas. And I talk exactly about that in the blueprint, but also in some of my previous videos on that channel, which are free. So feel free to explore that, and feel free to approach design as you should, as a process, not just as a single outcome and an invitation to a Figma file. Because if you go that path, it's gonna be way less profitable for you as a designer, freelancer, or a potentially small agency going forward. But I still believe small agencies are the future and designers are gonna be making really cool things. So let's get back to the course. If you think that high-fidelity designs and low-fidelity wireframes are the only things that you can present, you're wrong. You can also present data, either with tables, charts, or graphs, and we're gonna take some data sets that I have here in my Figma file, and we're gonna present them in a nice visual way. So let's start with the first one. It's gonna be a line graph with a couple of numbers. So this is stuff that you can find, for example, in Google Trends, and this is actually exactly what we're gonna portray here. First, we need to create the axis of our chart. So I'm gonna create a horizontal line using the line tool or the path tool. Now let's change the color to a light gray, but it has to be dark enough so it's still visible. For the line thickness of the axis in graphs and charts, I usually go with 2. Because it basically looks the best. Okay, now let's create the other part of that little chart on the top side, and then let's add some space on the sides. So you can just select both of them and simply drag and change the size. Data like that is often presented in case studies, so it's really good that the alignment is not off. I'm gonna create 2 squares, 120 by 120 and 60 by 60, and of course I'm gonna change them to red. The first thing that we're doing here is to position the square on the left side of the screen towards the bottom, and then I'm gonna make those lines a little bit shorter so they match the square on the left side. And then I want to match it also on the top side. So there is this distance of 120 from both the left and the bottom. Now we have another square that's 60 by 60 here. I'm gonna use that square to align it from the top and from the right side for the top line, but also from the right side for the bottom line. That way we'll have twice as much space on the left side and on the bottom as on the right side and on the top. This is exactly what we want because we will have labels for the vertical axis here. Okay, now let's duplicate that line again and place it exactly in the center. And if you drag your mouse over all of the lines, you can use the alignment tool to basically distribute it evenly, so that middle line will be exactly in the middle of the other two. This is also what we want. The bottom line is the axis itself, but the top two lines are only going to be helpful to be better able to visualize where on the data chart we are. I decreased their opacity, making them lighter. Now I'm going to duplicate the bottom line and just drag one of the edges of it to make a vertical one. And this is going to be also a little bit darker because this is the main y-axis. Now, depending on the data that you have, you might create additional lines in the middle here. I see that my values go from 0 to about 1.5 million because 1.37 is close to 1.5. So actually it's better if I divide my lines into 500,000 increments. So I'm just gonna create a label that says 1.5 at the top, and I could add a label saying 750k in the middle here, but I think it's actually better to create two lines over here and simply have one at 1 million and 500,000 and then the other one at 0. So I'm just gonna select all of them again and then distribute vertically. And here we are. So now the next one is just gonna be 1 million, 500,000 and 0. Now select all of them, make them a little bit smaller, lighter and right aligned, because we want them to be aligned to the axis itself. It's just gonna make it easier to actually get it. And we don't want them to be too visible, but of course they can't be completely invisible because that kind of defeats the purpose. So something like this works good. And also I like to align the bottom value to the bottom of the axis, but then the middle values to the middle of those lines, and then the top one to the top like this. You can move it to the middle as well, but it looks always a little bit off. And as for just a description or a label, it works quite fine. Now I duplicated the label because we want all the labels on the axis to be the same font size and color, and I'm gonna create the months and then basically distribute them because they're all 3 letters, they're roughly the same size, so you can just drag the last one to the very end and simply use the automatic horizontal distribution. Now I'm gonna bring them closer to the axis so they are roughly similar distance to it as the numbers on the left side. Now let's create dots in the place on the y-axis and the x-axis that matches the actual date. So if it was like January or February, 0.2 million, and then in the last quarter it was 1.37, then simply distribute them that way. Then using the pen tool or the path tool, click through from the beginning of the graph towards each of the circles and just click in the center of each one, creating a line that connects all of them. And if you have to, just zoom in to be sure that you're exactly in the middle of the circle, because if you're off, it's really gonna show. So just click into the middle of each one and you have yourself your first chart. But of course we're not gonna leave it like this. What were you thinking? So let's start with changing the color of the line to the green that is matching our app. So of course if your app has a different primary color, change it to that color. And I'm gonna make this line thicker. I'm gonna go with 6, but you can try even thicker than that. And this is like a very quick, basic, minimal option 1. Now that we have all the data in place, we actually might also want to add a label to it. So in this case, I'm gonna actually increase the height of this to have another 120 by 120 square from the top. In most design tools, you can just drag the edge like that by holding Shift, Alt, or Control. It really differs depending on the tool. And then I'm gonna remove that square that we created, and in that space, I'm gonna move our label here. And I'm gonna rename it to be actually a little bit easier. So I'm gonna call it 2020 searches for Echo products because this is the actual category of my app. That label has to be pretty big and pretty bold, so it's really easy to actually understand what the chart is about. And of course, align it to the left axis, to the y-axis on the left side. And then if we have that 120 height, above the chart, then simply align it to the middle of that. And of course, that very first point is never at 0 or almost never at 0. So just place it somewhere on the left side, assuming that we don't really have that data, but it's really not that important. Now let's duplicate it and create an option 2. And this option requires us to duplicate the entire line that we created. And to make it look better, first let's stretch that last point to the actual right edge of the entire chart, like this. And now let's add some additional points using the path tool again. Simply click onto the last point on the bottom. So just drag using shift so you have a vertical line. And then click on the left side again and then onto the last point. So basically we created a fill under our chart. And of course, because I duplicated first and then modified, I need to also modify that initial line, the original one, to also end in that same spot. So I'm dragging that last point to the right edge of the chart. And of course, we also need to move that circle to be in the right spot too. Now let's select the new shape that we created, the one under the line, remove the stroke from it and add a fill. And for now, let's add the exact same color of the fill that we had before. Then we can start to modify this a little bit, but of course, if you like it that way, you can just leave it. So first thing that I'm gonna do is gonna change it to a linear gradient. But for the gradient to actually be a little bit more defined, I'm gonna decrease the opacity on both sides. So one side is completely transparent, the other one is like semi-transparent, and then I'm gonna make the gradient kind of follow the general direction of the chart. And a simple option like that works quite well. So let's duplicate it again and then let's make some changes. So the next thing that you can do is remove all the circles and just keep the line. It also looks quite nice, even with that faded background under the line as well, but it looks a little bit more minimal. So if you like this, it works. But what we can do with a simple chart like that is to add a point where things begin to change rapidly. So in this case, where the graph begins to climb very significantly. And I'm gonna create a new circle there and add a stroke to it that's the color of the line, which is gonna be a green stroke. And on the inside, it's gonna be a white fill. The thickness of the stroke is going to be the same as the thickness of the line, so in my case it's going to be 6. Now let's use the path tool or the pen tool to create another line. And this time I'm going to go diagonally by holding shift and then create a horizontal line by holding shift again. And we have ourselves a little annotation kind of thing. But of course it can't be the same color because it would clash with the chart itself. So first let's make it a little bit thinner. I'm gonna make it 2 times thinner. So from 6 we're gonna go down to 3. And then I'm gonna make it a little bit darker and more desaturated. The reason for having charts or graphs in your case studies or in your portfolios is to tell a story of what is happening and why. So what we can do here is to add a little bit of text that is saying that on that particular day or that particular month, something happened. And I'm just gonna call it rapid growth, and I'm just gonna add some percentages that I think that it rose by. But of course, you need to calculate that yourself for the actual data that you have. Then I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller and just place it over the line here. That way we'll have a simple chart that also shows a point where something happened. So when somebody's scrolling through the case study, they're gonna instantly notice that you're actually paying attention to the data and you parse and highlight the most important things. Okay, so let's duplicate the second one and create option 4 here. For that option, I'm gonna remove the circles again, and then for the line color, I'm gonna change it to that darker shade of green that we have by leaving the background to be the lighter shade. That way, actually, we can decrease the opacity of it a little bit more, so we have more of a contrast. Okay, let's duplicate this one again, and let's create another option. Just like we had a gradient here before, I'm gonna replace this gradient with a solid color, like this. And of course, if you like this version, you can leave it like that, like fully filled, completely opaque if you want, and it can look pretty nice as well. But I'm gonna decrease the opacity a little bit so we see the helper lines for 500,000 and 1 million going through it. And what we can do here also to differentiate it a little bit is to add a linear gradient to the actual line. But of course the gradient needs to start at the beginning of the line and end at the end of it. And we can't have transparency in the gradient like this because that way it's gonna clash with the element on the back. So what we can do is to modify the colors. So one of the colors, preferably near the beginning of the graph, could be darker and the other one could be a little bit lighter. But in this case, don't go too light because we don't want it to completely merge with that fill underneath. And if you like the gradient kind of line, you can duplicate this and just remove the fill from under it. You can also add more lines, so it doesn't have to be just one line on the chart if you have multiple categories that you want to compare. Just make sure that the lines are easy to differentiate so they're different colors. Okay, now let's work on the second option. So for this one, we're actually gonna create a pie chart. So I duplicated the frame, but for now let's remove everything from it. And for pie charts, it's a little bit tricky because I can't really say how much space we need, so I'm just gonna increase the size of the frame just in case. And right from the start, I'm just gonna paste in the title of our chart, make sure it's the same exact font that we have, and let's start with the actual data. In Figma, there's a couple of ways to create a pie chart, including using the actual strokes for this, not the fills. But I want to use a method that you can use in any design tool, which is gonna be using filled shapes with some Boolean subtract operations. So I'm just gonna create a circle, then duplicate it, and we want that circle on top to be smaller, like this. The good thing is that the thickness of the chart that we're gonna achieve here can be easily adjusted later. So once you have both selected, go to the Boolean operators and go to subtract. And now we have a donut. Okay, now let's start filling it with data. So we are pretty lucky because one of our percentages is 25%, which is exactly a quarter of this entire donut. So let's just create a rectangle like this and position it in a way that one of the edges of it, one of the corners, is exactly in the middle of the circle. And then pick the very first color. So I'm just gonna go with that little yellow close to green that we have in our app, and then I'm gonna click Add as Mask. What it did is created a part of the pie chart that we need here. So now inside that mask, duplicate this little rectangle that we created and then move it towards the bottom like this. And as you see, you can move it within the actual object, but make sure that the corner, this time the top left corner, is still in the center of the circle. Now let's modify the color a little bit. So starting from the orange that we had, we're gonna go towards the green, but make it a little bit desaturated. Now press enter, and without modifying the edges here, so keeping that one in the center always, just drag the one on the bottom towards the left side. That way we're gonna fill more of that circle and just keep it until we have the right percentages. I'm aiming for 34 and 31, but these are so close that it doesn't really matter if they're a little bit off. So now once we have this one, let's duplicate it again and let's create the other one. So this time it's gonna be a little bit more tricky, but of course it's still possible. Let's modify the color first so we can see it against the other one. Once we're ready with that, press enter to go into the corner editing mode, and in that mode you can select first of all the very middle point and move it to the center of the circle again. It doesn't have to be like super precisely in the center, but as close to the center as you can, and then simply drag the other point to match. Now you can drag this point to actually fill the part of the circle that you need. So we need space for just 10% on the very top of it. So you can modify this way, just by dragging those points on the outsides, but keeping the point in the middle of the circle in the same place. Because we adjusted one of those, we have a little bit of white space in between of them, so I'm just gonna go into the previous color again and simply press enter on it and then modify that last point. Now we can create a triangle using the path tool. So just quickly trace it like this from the bottom and make sure that the vertical line is completely vertical. Just create a triangle. The point in the middle should be exactly in the middle of the circle, and then fill it with the color. So in this case, it's gonna be the lighter green that we have. And as you can see, there's still some space on the left side here because I didn't place the orange rectangle precisely. And just here as well, I'm gonna zoom in and simply move things closer together. Now, because we kept one of those center points always in the center of the circle, you can go back to the mask that we created, pick the ellipse that you have in the middle, and by holding the Shift key or the Alt key in some tools, you can proportionally scale it. So you can make those elements a little bit thinner or thicker as you wish. There are some plugins that you can use to generate things like that, but making them yourself, first of all, is actually quite easy and quite fast. It allows you to always make it consistent with the rest of your case study or your portfolio, and allows you to get a little bit more creative in the editing. And as I said, the technique that I used here is a technique that works in a very similar way in all of the design tools. Now let's create a legend for it. So I'm just going to create a circle, and I'm gonna fill it with the first color, then duplicate one of the smaller fonts that we have. And this is price, so I'm just gonna call it price and then add the percentages there. It's just gonna be the label and the percentages, so the text field doesn't have to be that long. You can of course move it closer to the circle, make it smaller, and then simply duplicate it and repeat the same steps for all the remaining colors. Now, of course, because it goes 25, 34, 31, and 10, it's not really going in like an ascending or descending direction. So I'm just gonna modify it in a way where we have them starting from the largest number and then going down to the smaller one. You can select them all and group them to have the labels easily modifiable. And since we used 60 before, I'm gonna create a new square again, just 60 by 60, make it red, and then I'm gonna align things to it. So first I'm gonna start with aligning the label that we have, and I'm gonna align it optically to the bottom top of the capital letter here. Then on the left side, I'm gonna select my entire group and align it to the left here. And if the distances between those objects are proportional, you don't need to align it to the right edge like this. This is completely fine if there is that space. But of course you can also align it to the bottom and make sure that the actual chart is in the middle, so it's in between the title and those little descriptive legend labels. Now let's duplicate this again, and this is gonna be a very simple and very quick change. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna modify all the colors that we have on our pie chart to gradients, and they'll all be going in the same direction around the circle. So the darker or lighter color is gonna be always on that same edge. So the darker color of one element is gonna touch the lighter color of the next one. You can use a gradient with reduced opacity, or you can simply increase or decrease the brightness. Now make sure that the direction of the gradient is going right, so it has to be a little bit diagonal and going kind of along the circle, and simply repeat that step for all the other colors. And with that one simple change, we still have consistent colors, but now the gradient looks a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. Now let's duplicate that very first option again, and let's make some additional changes to it. In this version, I'm gonna duplicate this entire pie chart and then simply move it out of the frame. What we want to do here is just keep the largest portion, so remove those additional colors from it completely. That way we only have this one little element. Now let's make sure that the proportions are locked and then slightly increase it. We don't want it to be too big because otherwise it won't fit what we want it to do. Now adjust the size of this element so it actually sticks out of the pie chart, but it doesn't really change the starting and ending point of the element, kind of like this. You can leave it at that, so this next part is completely optional, but just to make it stand out a little bit more, or just to show you what else you can do, you can add a drop shadow to just this one element and pick the color of the element for the shadow, then simply increase the Y value a little bit and then increase the blur quite a lot. It doesn't have to be double here, it actually can be quite big. Just make sure that the opacity is not too high. That way you'll have something of a glow around the element, and that can make it look nice and make it catch more attention. And because this one option got the most votes, I'm gonna make it a little bit more highlighted. So I'm just gonna pick the font from the header because it needs to be slightly bigger than normal for it to be visible inside the pie chart. And then I'm gonna place it here, write convenience, and then write the percentage in an even bigger font above. I'm gonna also change the color of the number, but that's of course completely optional, and make sure that if you do this, that the color is the same as the color of the corresponding part of the chart. This is a good way to show that you are taking into account what you got in the research. So in our case, if convenience is that important to the users, that our app in the portfolio should actually focus on convenience. Okay, let's duplicate it again and make one more option. This time it's gonna be an option with white gaps in between the elements, and you can do it in two different ways. First way is to simply draw thick white lines, and it's probably the easier way. But if you want to have your pie chart on a transparent background, then this way that I'm showing here is probably better. I'm duplicating the pie chart next to the frame 4 times, and in each of those versions I'm just leaving one color, so I'm just removing the remaining 3. That way we have all of our elements of the pie chart. Now let's bring it back together in the right spot, and if you want, you can make it easier by changing the opacity of the previous one so you can see where it begins and where it ends. And now it's only a matter of placing them in a way where the distances between them are pretty similar. It is possible, even though it's not quite easy. And in some cases you might have to modify the color element inside the mask to match it. But if you're planning to use a single solid color background, you can just draw a couple of thick lines on top and have the same effect a lot easier. Okay, now let's go to the third option that we're going to be making here, and this is going to be a data table. And once again, let's duplicate one of the frames, and let's start by copying and pasting the title of the table, which is Checkout Process Survey Study. This is something that is gonna be simply a table, but we don't want it to look generic, so I'll start by removing the pie chart that we had, and for a table it might be a little bit wider because of the data in it, so I'm just gonna make this frame a little bit bigger. And then I already have some data. It's not really looking pretty, but I'm gonna drag it on here nonetheless. I started by increasing the font size because if you have a table with just a couple of rows and columns, you can go with a larger font size to make it completely readable, and we're gonna go with much larger white space. But let's start with something for the labels. So I'm just gonna draw a rectangle over the labels, and I'm gonna make it 52 points high. And for the color, for the fill color, I'm gonna pick our green. But of course, if your app or project has different colors, then use your colors in all of those charts and graphs and tables. Okay, now I'm gonna drag it to the bottom of the layer list. Just make sure that it's still within the frame. It sometimes kind of gets out like this. And we have our labels now on this background. Let's move the actual data out of the way a little bit, and let's play around with this. I rounded the corners of this green rectangle here a little bit as well. And I'm gonna modify the label names a little bit so they're shorter, and in most cases if you can shorten them, it's gonna basically make it look a lot easier to parse and process. If one of the names, for example, one of the labels is much longer than the rest of them, it just stands out from the grid, and we don't want that effect. We want those tables or data tables to be easy to scan through. So I added convenience to the list, and I'm just gonna invent some numbers here, but of course if you have your real numbers you should definitely use those. This is just to show you how to create those data structures. Make sure that the bounding box of the labels is roughly the size of the labels themselves. There is an option for it as well, but here I have overall impression, which is a little bit too long, so I'm just gonna call it quality, which is the perceived quality of the project by the users. And I'm gonna click this icon here. It exists in most design tools that allows you to shrink the field to the size of the actual text in it, like this. And it's really useful here. So let's do it for all of them. We are using first names here only, but of course if you have last names as well, or longer names in the table, or longer data in the very first column, you can leave a little bit more space in there. I'm gonna create a rectangle that's 720 pixels wide, and this is because 720 divides by 4 very easily. It's simply 180. Knowing that, I'm gonna create 4 rectangles that are 180 wide, and their height doesn't really matter. They're gonna help us align the content. If you want to have it better visible where one begins and the other one ends, you can select the middle and the last one in our case and simply decrease the opacity like that. They're gonna be simple helpers, so you can select both the rectangle and the text label and simply align them to the center. That way, of course, make sure that it's roughly in the center in the first place, but that way we'll have them in the right spot all the time. And they're gonna be proportionally distributed in terms of how they play around with the text. Now let's select all the labels, bring them a little bit higher so they're in the vertical center of that background. Now I'm gonna change their color to white and set them at 100% opacity. If you're using a lighter green, you can use a darker font on it as well, of course, because we need some accessibility to this, and try to aim for AA. so AA accessibility standard. And then I'm gonna decrease the size of those labels because they're not that important. Data is what's important. And just to make sure, I'm gonna align them together and then simply select all of them again and place them in the vertical center one more time. If you change their size or their location a little bit, you might have to align them to those helper rectangles one more time, but that's pretty easy. Just select both of them and click this one icon. Because the label for name is aligned to the left side of the title, it doesn't look right with the background. So I'm gonna align the background to the left edge of the title text like this. Just move it to the right. And you can decrease the size of the frame to match it on both sides. So if you have 60 on the left, then have 60 on the right as well. This is a completely personal preference, but I like the data in data tables bigger, a lot bigger. So I'm gonna increase the font size, and for the color, I'm gonna pick the color from the background of the header here, the green, and I'm gonna decrease the brightness and the saturation until it's a pretty dark gray with a little bit of green in it. That works really well, especially for larger data sets, because it simply matches the colors and it makes it all just come together a lot more naturally than if you just use the black font. Okay, now I'm gonna duplicate that background that we have for the labels, just move it down a little bit and make sure that it's lower on the layer list. And then I'm gonna increase the height of this from 52 to 70. Of course, you can use a different number. You can use 48 and 64, for example, as the combo. Then I'm gonna change the fill color to white and add a very thin stroke to it and make sure that the stroke is on the inside. You can pick that stroke color from the letters, from the font that we set before, because we want it to be gray but with a hint of that primary color, the green in it. But I want it to be a little bit brighter, so I'm just gonna increase the brightness until it's pretty light but still visible. Of course, we can bump it with the contrast a little bit more still. Now I'm gonna move that group with the helpers to the right side of the frame here for now, and then I'm gonna bring this whole thing closer to our label background, and I make sure that the distance between them is 8 points. So I just have a couple of rows with 8 points between them. Now let's place the data in the middle of those newly created rows. Now I'm gonna repeat this entire process again for the numbers, and of course I'm gonna bump their size up a little bit as well. Some say that center alignment of data in tables is good, but I don't believe it is. So I'm gonna modify this still. So I'm just gonna grab those helper rectangles and move them to the left until the distance from the right edge is similar to the distance of the names from the left edge. Now I'm gonna align all those labels to the right side of each of those rectangles, like this. And now let's align those numbers the same way. So just align each one to the right. And now that we have more of an understanding on how the table looks, I'm gonna revert to that smaller font size again. It's still a little bit bigger than the labels, and I'm fine with that. Just make sure to center the text inside those fields, and you can center it optically if you know the red square method, but it's not that important in data tables because they're being browsed through pretty quickly in case studies. So in this case, you can do the automatic alignment as well. What you can also do is create in smaller font a couple of descriptions for what those numbers actually mean. So what is the higher score, what is the lower score, for example, and I'm gonna do that just for the highest and the lowest score just to show what's the difference, and I'm gonna attach a color to each of those scores. And then for some of the lowest and highest scores in the data table, I can add the same circles with the same colors to signify where the data is actually showing that there is a significant trend either up or down. And because we don't have a score of 1, which is gonna be red, then naturally score of 2, which is closer to the red, is gonna be orange. And I'm gonna add that orange circle as well. This is completely optional and you don't need to add it at all, but if you decide to add it, don't add it to all the numbers. It's just to show which table or which row or which column has the highest and lowest scores in a section. Okay, now let's duplicate this entire option and let's create a more minimal table. So this table is not going to have a green background on the top. I'm gonna change it to white, and I'm actually going to copy the style or the properties of those actual fields because I want that same border there. And now let's change the color of the labels to be darker so it's visible. time, we're not gonna have gaps between the rows, but we want the rounded corners to only be on the outside of the table. So I'm just gonna press enter on the top rectangle and gonna drag and select just the bottom two corners. Now I'm gonna click on the bottom one and select just the top two and decrease the border radius down to 0 here. Then of course the two middle ones are gonna have border radius of 0 because they're not gonna be rounded at all. Now let's remove the dots here and let's bring them all together. So I'm just gonna select an entire line and simply move it to the top until it reaches the previous one. If your research sections of the case study have a lot of colorful charts and graphs, going with minimal tables like that is a good idea. Just make sure to use a consistent font for all of it so it's not out of place, and consistent colors for highlights or labels or whatever you're using them for. Just make sure that it matches, but it doesn't have to be very strong visually. Let's create one more duplicate, and in this case I'm gonna change the background of this a tiny bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna decrease the brightness by 3 points from 100 to 97. And of course we can pick a different color here, but let's just keep it at gray. So 97 here again with alternating rows, and that way we have a table that's a little bit clearer to read. Now what we want to do is to drag the hue slider towards the green a little bit, and you can pick the same hue and just copy it and add just 3 points saturation. Of course, if your primary color is different to green, like blue for example, do the same thing with blue. And it can be even smaller of a difference, so it doesn't have to be subtracting or adding 3 points. And then for the label field, I'm gonna subtract a couple more points from brightness, so it's a little bit darker. That gives it a more defined look and also shows you where the table actually begins, which is sometimes good. Once you created a table this way and you see that there is quite a lot of white space in the rows, you can squish it a little bit. For that, I'm gonna select all the numbers and all the labels from just one row and then just bring it together to the next row by a certain amount of points. So let's say 50, and then let's do the same 50 or 100 towards the next one. Then select the additional ones holding shift and then bring it to the third one or fourth one by the exact same number. Then select all of them and bring them together towards the names to the left. And once you leave proportional white space, you'll be fine to actually select all of those table rows just by dragging across them and making this table not as wide. When making it narrower, just make sure that the distance from the last line to the edge of the table now is similar or the same to the distance on the left side here. So let's just shrink it a tiny bit more. Now we can shrink the entire frame, and obviously if we used 60 and 120 for all our spacings, let's do it the same way here. So I see there is 59 from the left side, so I'm just gonna move everything 1 point to the right, and then I'm gonna adjust the frame size so it's 60 on the right side as well. When showing a lot of data like this, charts, graphs, tables, it's really good to keep those consistent spacing throughout all of them. This simply makes your portfolio a lot easier to process, so once people are going through your wireframes, through your high-fidelity designs, and then they stop at the data part of your case study, they're gonna be quite surprised how easy it is to just browse, how easy it is to look through. And this is the goal of those data presentations, to have them looking consistent with the projects. That's why we're using the same fonts and the colors, but also to have them as easy to read as possible. That's why we're using pretty tall rows in the tables. I hope some of these ideas will keep you inspired to create your own unique individual versions of data presentations. They are very important to your success, however. A good engaging case study is all about mixing the right proportions of the high fidelity, the low fidelity, and then presenting your research data. So make sure that your research data is consistent with those designs, because if it just looks like you copied it and pasted it from Excel or from some other spreadsheet app, it's not gonna be as impressive for recruiters. These techniques are pretty quick and they get the job done. Good luck. The natural way of doing things in the UX process is to start with a low fidelity wireframe and then transition into a high fidelity beautiful design. We are going to put this process on its head a little bit because we are assuming that we already have the high fidelity designs and now we need some wireframes to show in our portfolio to show how we arrived at this process. So this is basically reverse engineering the UX process and starting with the high fidelity designs. I'm gonna show you two techniques to convert your high fidelity designs into wireframes. One is gonna be on paper using a pencil and the other one is going to be digital. So we're gonna take those high fidelity designs and basically convert them into this. As you can see, there is some fidelity in those wireframes. For example, the icons are actual outlines of the icons and not some placeholders. And I believe it's the better way to actually doing wireframes for portfolios and case studies, because that way it's gonna be clear what these icons mean and there's not gonna be just simple random shapes everywhere. Creating wireframes like that is not that difficult. You can just trace your own phone basically to create a couple of shapes, and they don't even need to be properly aligned on the piece of paper that you're using. They can be anywhere because we're gonna cut them out and use them all individually. It's good to use a template like this, tracing out an actual phone instead of trying to draw these by yourself, because that way you're sure that they're gonna be consistent. Unless you have a very steady hand, which I don't, you can use something like a ruler or a credit card to help you with this. What helps is to have those high fidelity UIs visible on a display right next to you, so basically while you're sketching, you're actually seeing the individual screens, so you know what to do and where. So just add most of the text that's on the screens, excluding the description text. So if there's like a longer description somewhere, you can just create a couple of lines in that place. But in most other cases, just create the text. And try to use similar shapes for buttons and try to outline or trace the icons that you're using as well. Because it's still low fidelity, but it needs to be clear that those high fidelity designs actually came from these. And this is what we end up with. Pretty unimpressive, right? But it's good because our high fidelity designs are impressive. So the bigger the difference between those wireframes and the high fidelity end result, the better. Now simply take a photo of your wireframes and make sure that there are no shadows, so you're not casting a shadow of your hands, your head, or the phone itself onto the piece of paper, so it's as clear as possible. It doesn't have to be well lit or it doesn't have to be super high quality, we're gonna go around that. I placed the wireframes on a new page next to the high fidelity screens that we have here. And then I'm gonna shrink them a little bit and zoom in. What we want to do here is to crop the image because we don't want that wooden background of the desk under the paper, and we don't even need as much paper around them. So just go into cropping. In most design tools, there is a way to actually crop raster images like that. Don't crop it too tightly though, as we still need a little bit of space on the sides, so it's gonna be easier to cut and rotate the individual screens. Now play around with the image editing tools like exposure, contrast, saturation, shadows, and in most cases decreasing saturation down to 0 is gonna be a good idea, because that's gonna remove all the color from it. That's basically what we want. But you can then modify the highlights, the shadows, the brightness a little bit until you end up with something as clear as possible. So we want a basically black and white or white and gray version of the wireframes as much as possible. Of course, avoid going too far with the sliders because you might be losing some detail, and we want that detail in there. So that's just enough. Okay, now take our image and duplicate it 3 times. Of course, you can do it in some other design tool or in Photoshop and simply cut them out from the background, but we're gonna use a much simpler technique. So on top of the first one, I'm just gonna draw a rectangle the size of the phone. It has to be roughly the size and roughly the right proportions. I'm gonna change the color to red and decrease the opacity a little bit. Now let's round the corners to the point where they match the actual corners of the outlined phone that we have. Okay, that seems about right. Now let's duplicate that same screen one more time and then duplicate that little frame that we created and move it on top of the second screen. Try to align it with the image underneath so that actually covers that image. It doesn't have any parts sticking out, and then repeat the process on the third one. Now on the layer list, select all the 3 rectangles that we just created and move them below the actual images. Then simply drag over them to select both of them, so both the image and the mask, and just click Use as Mask. That way you'll end up with 3 cutout masks of those images. Now select them and bring them all together, and preferably keep the order that you have the screens above. So basically they simply reflect one another, and each wireframe is below the actual high fidelity screen that you want here. Now this is optional, but it can work quite well. Go into a mask group and duplicate the image inside it, and then change the blending mode to overlay. That way, when you click through it, you'll see that the image actually becomes brighter and it has better contrast. That's because it merges 2 images on top of one another, and the difference is very clearly visible here. If you like this version, simply repeat the process for all the other masks. In some cases, having more than 2 layers can even work better, so you can duplicate the image 3 times, for example. You can also stretch the wireframe within the image, but it's best to group all those duplicated images first and then stretch the group. That way you'll end up with one that doesn't have the borders of the phone visible, for example, which is something that we might want here. In some cases you might have to rotate it if the version you created wasn't completely even. So yeah, I'm gonna rotate it by -0.5 degrees and then simply move it up and down a little bit until it matches and increase the size of it. They don't need to be exactly the same size as long as the proportions are close enough, so you might modify them independently and you don't really need to think about those sizes as much. So in here I'm just gonna make it a little bit larger, but we still ended up with a couple of lines here on the side, especially in the middle and the third screen. We see the line that we created, the outline of the phone, but when we move stuff too much to the side, it's not gonna look good. To make it easier to find the right mask, I'm just gonna rename those groups. I'm just gonna call them Map, Product, and Registration. Okay, now it's time to fix some visual problems with it. As you can see, there is an outline barely visible of something that I actually tried to erase from the wireframe. So let's create a rectangle and pick the color of the background here. And of course, it doesn't match completely because of the lighting that was on the actual photo, but you can add a small layer blur to it and then simply duplicate that object a little bit and just hide all the lines that are not necessary. That can make this whole wireframe look a lot better and clearer. Then repeat the process on all of them and make sure that the colors are being picked from the image that they actually belong to, because in some cases the lighting might be different between those images. So just picking the right colors and then just changing the shapes, moving them around and hiding the lines that we don't need here. The idea is to hide all the lines or all the artifacts or elements that got in the photo and that are not really part of the interface. So all the borders or the little smudges or everything like that. Just hide it. Okay, so we have a couple of wireframes done the old-fashioned method of pencil and paper. And this is all good, but of course we might also want to do low-fidelity wireframes digitally. And this is a lot easier and a lot faster. For that, we need to go into the actual screens and we need the sources of these screens. So I'm just gonna go into the designs that I created for them, select those screens, and then simply paste them over. We want to be able to edit individual layers. But of course, what we want to do here also is to have them in the right order. So the right screen is under the right wireframe. Once you're done with that, zoom into one of the screens and start removing all the decorative images and all the shadows from them. This is the very first starting point. Also remove all the icons and all the extra elements like that circle here. Now let's decrease the opacity of the button here because we're gonna use that sort of gray here. And also you can remove the placeholder text because this is something that is not really necessary on the low fidelity stage. If you have any Aurora background or background color, remove it as well. Then simply use that same color as the outline of your form fields, but make them thicker, make them seem like you actually did them with a pencil. For the fonts, it's good to go with a font that looks like it was handwritten, but it can't be too decorative. It has to be very legible and readable. So I chose marker felt, but of course there is a lot of similar fonts that you can use yourself as well. It's best for the low fidelity wireframes to actually have a font like that, like it looks that it has been written by somebody, because it's gonna make them stand out a little bit more from the high fidelity ones. And then when you place them side by side, it's gonna be clearly visible that there is a difference. And this is basically what we want. You don't even have to move stuff around. You can copy and paste styles to keep the fonts to basically 2 sizes because it's probably the best way. So even if your high fidelity design has more sizes, just stick with 2. It's just gonna make it easier to understand what is what on the low fidelity stage. And if you have some very small icon, you can enlarge them on this stage as well. And as you can see, we have the first one ready. So for the second one, let's remove the image and let's remove the background, the shadows, and all of the decoration that we have in the background. In case of the back arrows, it's good to actually go with chevrons, so just to keep it simple, then paste the properties of the font or the layer style from the font that we already have, the smaller one for the title of the screen, and then modify the icons. We want them to be a little bit lighter and we want to remove the notification bubble. There can be just like a number on its own because this implies that there is a notification, but that bubble is a little bit too high fidelity for us. And of course, you just need to move that number a little bit so it shows that it's a notification on how many objects are in the shopping bag. Okay, now it's time to switch the colors, so I'm just gonna select all of the outlines and simply pick a color from the outline that we have on the previous screen, but you can decrease the brightness a little bit of it. So it's a pretty light gray, but not too light. For the notification number, you can leave it as it is. And if the font that you're using, the handwritten one, doesn't look that great with numbers when they're small, you can leave it as the font that it was. It's really small. Now here, let's write product name because we don't really want to imply a product name, and then paste the properties of the larger font that we have. And let's just use those two, larger and smaller. Now for the price label, of course, remove the background. We don't want the background there. And then copy the properties of the smaller text again and then paste it to the price. And of course, you can then align the price to the left side, just like this. Of course, instead of $5, we can write price, but it's actually better to have the actual dollar value there because it's gonna make it easier to understand what that is. Then for the description text, we don't really want to have a lot of text there. So simply draw a couple of rectangles, gray rectangles on top of that text. And then on the layer list, simply remove the text. That shows that there is a description here. And that's a very nice way of doing this. Okay, now let's copy the properties of the smaller font again and paste it to the label. This icon here is purely decorative, so it's not really that essential to the interface. So in this case, we can simply remove it and then paste it one more time. And in some cases, if you have a choice of like thinner or a little bit heavier fonts, you can just differentiate between the two. That way you'll have a little bit of a difference between like the label and the actual value. Now let's remove the stars as well because as an item they're too complex. Let's just create 5 circles. So let's create one, then duplicate it, move it and duplicate it a couple more times. Since we already have one button here, the register button, let's simply group it, select it and then copy it. Now let's remove the colorful button that we have on the actual product screen and paste that button. Once it's on the right screen, move it into place. Now replace the text on the button to say add to bag because this is an important button, so we don't want a placeholder here. Now let's create a rectangle on the top side of the screen. That's gonna be a placeholder for our product image. And I'm gonna leave some margin on the sides because this wireframe is actually gonna be pretty consistent because of that. So I want this a little bit lighter and then I'm gonna duplicate the title here, paste it on top of that little rectangle and simply type in product photo. Then you can center it inside this little element because even though it's a wireframe, having things centered and having things aligned sort of well is actually a good idea. But since this is not a very important label, I'm just gonna decrease the opacity of it. Okay, for the clock, we can also add a placeholder icon. So I'm just gonna duplicate our placeholder stars, the circles, and just place them there. Now let's copy the shopping bag icon and paste them onto the button because we want to actually signify that this button also has an icon. And we don't want a placeholder here because even as a wireframe, it doesn't really tell you anything. If you just have a circle here, it's not really something that is gonna tell you what kind of icon is gonna be on that button. It's gonna be an arrow or a shopping bag or something completely different. So in that case, we actually have almost the right icon here. Now, instead of product names in similar products, just simply type product name in all of them and then paste the properties. And of course, you can then center it as well. Remove the images because obviously we don't really want the images here. And then you can copy the properties of that little image placeholder that we have here and paste them for the cards. Normally a lighter element is closer to you on the screen, but in this case we can actually break that rule a little bit. So let's just remove the other cards completely and let's create a circle that's gonna be a placeholder for the image. And we wanted to actually show that our idea from the very start was for that photo to be able to stick out from the frame, like this. And just simply add photo here. Now you can group this entire thing and duplicate it 2 more times next to it. And even though it's a wireframe, it's actually good to keep consistent spacing between those elements. So don't duplicate them randomly and place them randomly. Make the spacing between all 3 elements be exactly the same. Okay, on the third screen, first start with removing the map and then some color overlay on the top. And what we can also do is change the line here on the map to a solid color. This process is all about removing fidelity, but we don't want to remove too much fidelity because otherwise it's gonna be completely unreadable and we need to understand what we're looking at here. So the simpler the shapes and the objects, the better. Okay, we have some very big text here, so let's copy the properties or the style of that large text that we had there and simply paste it. Okay, that's looking good. Now for all the labels, we already have like a lighter color of that same font style. So let's just copy that and then select all of the labels and paste them. In some cases, you might have a duplicate of the text, like in this case, so just find it on the layer list and remove it. For the actual values that are a little bit bigger here, let's paste in the standard size. So we just differentiate the label from the actual data value by color alone. Okay, let's remove the co-driver button from here and also duplicate one of the buttons that we already have. And let's keep always the same kind of button. Even if we have to remove the arrow because it wasn't there, keep the size of the button and the shape of it the same. And in this case, also you should specify what the button does. Okay, I removed the logo and I'm gonna remove the description text as well. And since we already have some description placeholder, I'm just gonna paste it over here and kind of align it under the delivery from text. Now simply make it look like there is a little bit of text here by having those 2 lines. And it actually helps if one of the lines, the lower one, is shorter. That it actually kind of tricks people into thinking that this is text. I also created a rectangle for the placeholder for the logo, make it a little bit rounded, and then simply add logo into it. That way we'll know what this is. Okay, select the product placeholder and simply paste it onto this screen. Try to paste it closer to the bottom of the screen so it's under everything else. And let's position it in the place where the map was. And now we had a little bit of a shadow here to basically differentiate from the map and the card, so let's remove it. We don't really need shadows on the wireframe. Now let's pick one of those properties that we had for the cards and simply copy it and paste it onto that little button that allows you to select the location. Because we have a little bit more screen real estate and because it's a wireframe, you can move the path. You can keep it as it is exactly, but you can move it to be more in the center of the screen. Then basically create a little bit of a perspective and just start drawing some lines using the pen tool. It doesn't have to make a lot of sense, but make sure that all the lines are basically parallel to one another so that they are just basically going in just 2 directions. And just create a couple of different options here. Just lines. They don't have to be completely full. They don't have to be full rectangles, but as long as there is like quite a lot of them, it creates an illusion that this is like a low fidelity map. And of course you can just leave it as a gray rectangle and add map to it as a description or a label, but in this case it's just gonna look a little bit better on the actual wireframes. Once you have some roughly defined shapes, select all of them and then decrease the opacity so they're barely visible. And that way you end up with a map that actually looks like a map even at this stage. And normally in low fidelity wireframes you don't really do stuff like that, but this is a low fidelity wireframe coming from a high fidelity one, so in this case we can actually do it. Most people won't really notice reviewing this that the fidelity of the map is a little bit too high, and they're gonna be still impressed by it because it just looks better. Okay, now I'm gonna rearrange it. So I'm gonna place the highest fidelity, the beautiful designs on the top, then those digital low fidelity wireframes in the middle, and then those paper ones at the bottom, because you can actually structure it that way. You can create those super low fidelity ones on paper and even add those digital ones later and have a lot more created content to show, and this is actually good because it shows that you've done a lot of work. Now, to be able to better manipulate those images, I'm gonna export them to desktop and then simply drag them back in. I moved the source files out of the way and then placed the actual flat PNG images under the corresponding high fidelity design. Okay, this is gonna make it a lot easier for us to work with this. You can round the corners of those images if you want, and if it's not possible in the design tool that you're using, you can create a rounded cornered mask and simply mask those images with it. Try to match the roundness of the bottom button when you can. Okay, time to present our work. So we have some low fidelity wireframes here, so let's create a frame. And it has to be roughly 16 by 9, but it doesn't really matter because you can modify it at any point. Now let's drag those wireframes that we created onto the frame, and let's try to position them at the same distance from one another, but they don't have to be on the same height. Now let's add a shadow to them, and I'm gonna add a pretty big shadow of like 16Y and 32 blur, or possibly even bigger. If our little cover-ups broke the color like that, that's fine. You can still either remove some of them or just switch their color or switch their blur to the right one. So in our case, we can just simply go into the color and use the color picker from the background again. And this is looking pretty good. Just make sure to check it so you don't end up with some random color shapes on top of the wireframes. Now let's add a shadow to the remaining two. So in this case, I'm gonna go with 16 and 32 again. But if you don't like how that shadow looks, or maybe it just doesn't look too good on the top of there, you can increase the blur as well, so like 52 or something like that, and then decrease the opacity. That will make it a much softer, nicer to look at shadow. Now select all of the wireframes and make sure that they are in the center of our frame, and then play around with their position from the top and the bottom. We don't want them to be too high or too low, but we don't really want them to symmetrical. It's usually best if one of them is a little bit higher than the other, and the lower one could be the lowest. And this is going to be option 1. So let's duplicate it now and let's play around with it some more. So the first thing that we can do is use the 13-degree rule, which is basically how to make any wireframe or design look better. Just make sure that the distance between the elements on the sides is the same for all of them. So in this case, it's not exactly the same, and I'm gonna rearrange them a little bit so it just looks better. It usually takes a while, and it's best to do it right. So don't just randomly place these things. They need to be at the same distance, and they also need to cover most of the frame here. So what I mean is that they need to be evenly distributed. Now it's time to make our low fidelity wireframes shine. I'm making a small rectangle next to the wireframes, and inside I'm just gonna add a text field saying login screen. And we're gonna add a little bit of a flow here. And in this case, let's use the standard font that we used in the actual app. I'm gonna make it multi-line and then simply decrease the size of the rectangle to basically have enough white space on each side of the text, but not too much. And then let's round the corners a little bit, not too much either. Try to make it proportionally rounded to the actual wireframes. So in this case, this amount of roundness should be enough. Now let's change the color to white and let's add a shadow to it. For the shadow, I'm gonna go with 8, and for the blur, it's gonna be 24. And then simply select both of these elements, group them together. You can still modify the shadow. So in my case, going with 15 opacity is usually best because it's a little bit more subtle. And then simply rotate this entire group 13 degrees as well. Now place it here on the side of the element. The idea is to piece together a little bit of the flow here. So the back arrow next to register actually takes us to the login screen. So let's create a circle there. Let's pick the green color that we have in our app, because this is also gonna contrast quite well with the black and white wireframes. And then add another dot like that on top of our little login screen rectangle. I'm gonna go with a round version here. So using the pen tool, I'm gonna click inside the first dot, and then I'm gonna click between the dots, and then I'm gonna bend the line a little bit. Now holding shift, I'm gonna click down, and obviously that line is not in the center, so now you can move the entire line around. Now pick the same color for the line. So I'm just gonna pick the color from the dots, and you can leave it at pretty thin, but I'm gonna go a little bit thicker. So I'm gonna go with 4. You can go with a thinner line. So for example, 2 in the thickness, or you can go with a dashed or dotted line as well. Okay, now let's add some more of these things, because it's best to actually have them also evenly distributed throughout the screen. So now I'm gonna add another one that says confirm account. And just as before, just duplicate those dots. You can add them to the border of the button, for example. It doesn't have to be next to the arrow, but just make sure that in that little overlay that says confirm account, that circle is in the middle of its side. And now using the pen tool again, simply connect those two dots together. If the alignment is a little bit off, like in this case, you can click and select one of those points and simply use the keyboard to move it by 1 pixel. That way you'll be able to actually place it right. And I want this to be a little bit bigger, so I'm just gonna increase the font here as well. What you can also do, and it's completely optional, is to add more layer blur to the shadow that has the text like this bigger, because that will imply that this is actually closer to the user. Now let's duplicate this entire element and then place it on the top right of the middle screen. I'm gonna change the text to say add to favorites. That's because this is what one of the action is doing here, the heart. But of course you can also specify what the shopping bag does, or what the notifications are, or that the notifications actually bring you to the shopping bag. Once again, paste in the dots, but don't cover the icon. If the element is smaller than the dot, then simply place it on top of each other. And in that case, you can actually create a straight line between them. So just simply click right through. But one important thing to remember, and I'm gonna play around with this a little bit more. I pressed enter, and then I can modify the individual elements again. What we want is for that line to be at the same exact angle as the border of our phones. So this is not exactly right still. And I'm gonna zoom in a little bit and then simply move this 1 point by selecting it and then moving the dot. Now I'm gonna duplicate that little description bubble one more time and add it below the last screen. And I'm gonna make it bigger and also make the font bigger. And I'm gonna call this checkout process, because in this case we want something that is one of the most important processes of the app, but it's not really shown on the wireframes. So let's make this text bigger. Well, not that big. So I'm gonna go with like 36. Center the font and center it within the rectangle as well. Okay, in this case we need a couple more dots, so I'm gonna place one of the dots at the add to bag button, because this is something that adds us to the shopping cart, and then it leads to the checkout process, but then the checkout process itself leads to the delivery screen. So on the other side of the checkout process label here, I'm gonna add another dot and then another dot just next to the screen that is showing where the driver is. Now it's time to connect the dots, and this is something that most designers do on a daily basis. You can try to connect them a little bit more rounded like this, but I don't think that this works in many cases, and we don't want those roundnesses to be random. So I start with a straight line, and that straight line is basically going the same direction as the perspective of the phones, like this. Then I create a little 45-degree angle and then bend it by holding and dragging the mouse cursor. And then once it's in the right spot, I hold shift and then I click one more time to create another straight line. And if you need to, just move the circle around. Now let's repeat the process on the other side, because this is showing how the connections between the screens are going. So I'm just gonna create a straight line first, then a 45-degree one, bend it, and then simply add, holding shift, and standard line going forward. And if you're not a fan of having too many large fonts in the elements, you can also decrease the size of that font and then decrease the size of the box. But I'm still gonna keep it a little bit larger than all of the other fonts here. And then simply decrease the height of the box, and in this case the circle should be in the middle, preferably, so just like this. And what you can do here is simply move the entire line to the top. If it ends up sticking from the top circle, from the top of it, simply press enter and then modify the actual edge points. Okay, now let's add the final element, which is gonna be next to the location icon. And I'm gonna just copy the smaller one because this element is not really that important. It just gives a little bit of context. So I'm just gonna call it locate via GPS. Make sure that the text is optically in the center of that rectangle, and then simply let's copy some additional dots here. And if you already have dots and a connecting line like this, you can just select all of them, group them, duplicate, paste them to the new position, and then rotate 180 degrees. Now let's place one of the dots in the middle of that little object here, and since we can't really place it in the middle of like the edge, let's place it on the corner like this. And this is starting to look pretty good, but I see that this line is still not perfect. It's still not completely aligned to the edge of the actual screen. So I'm just gonna drag it out and see, and yes, now it is. So I'm just gonna bring it back here, and once it's back, I just need to move that little circle a little bit to the right, and yes, this is perfect. And these are just wireframes, but having that alignment and those proper angles and that proper perspective is really important. Now simply select everything and move it to the center of the frame. What you can also do for your case study is to show the entire process that you supposedly went through. Of course, in this case, we really didn't because we started with high fidelity, but I'm not gonna tell if you're not gonna tell. So I'm pasting in the super low fidelity paper and pencil wireframe first, and then I'm gonna paste the high fidelity one, and then in between of them I'm gonna paste the one that we did digitally. And that can be a very nice break in the actual case study, a break between some other more like intense or heavy sections, to show that the process is actually starting with something low fidelity, with planning, and then it gets a little bit more detailed, and then at the end you'll end up with a beautiful high fidelity design. And of course, let's add a shadow to all of them so they look consistent. And for that shadow, I'm gonna decrease the opacity once again to 15%. While presenting the high fidelity mockups, we also used an Aurora style background of some very light overlapping gradients and blurs. So let's paste it in here as well, and I'm gonna bring it to the bottom of the screen. You can try pasting it to some of the other screens like this one with those overlays, because this might actually make it look even better because of those overlays standing out a little bit more. But for the wireframe part, going with a purely white background is also often the good idea. Once we have just a tiny bit of color, like those dots and lines that connect those different flow elements, we're fine, and the wireframes don't need to be too complex. Okay, now let's make one more option, and this time it's just gonna be those digitally created low fidelity wireframes. So I'm just gonna create a new frame, paste all of them in, and add a shadow similar to the shadows that we've been adding to all of them before, which is 16Y and 32 blur, and then 15% opacity of the shadow, because I like them pretty light. But of course we're not gonna leave them like that because they look pretty boring. So I'm just gonna rotate them 13 degrees one more time, and then redistribute them along the frame so that distances between them are a little bit bigger, but obviously they have to be the same from each one. And having 3 images like that, you can add those dots and those little overlays with the flow elements to them in this one as well, but I'm gonna do something different. I'm gonna bring them closer together, and let's assume that I have more of those wireframes created. And if you have more screens in high fidelity, as you can see, it's pretty easy and quick to create more. So let's create a full grid of those. For wireframes, it doesn't have to be completely full, and what you can do is simply add a background from a light color from one of the previous backgrounds, but this time it's not gonna be a gradient, it's gonna be a solid color. And then let's go back into the shadow and pick the same color as the background for the shadow color, and then simply decrease the brightness a little bit. In the high fidelity mockups, we sometimes use the X value of the shadow as well. So let's try this here. So increase the blur and try the same X and Y values. And I'm gonna go with something a little bit larger, like 40, to have those deep, strong shadows. And sometimes a simple grid of low fidelity wireframes like this is also a nice way to visually break up the entire case study. Okay, let's duplicate option 5 that we have here, and I'm gonna remove the background, the blurred background from the very first low fidelity one, because I think that in some cases this can actually work well on its own. So let's duplicate this one here, and for this one we're gonna add some additional annotations, but we're gonna make them look a little bit different. I'm starting with a circle exactly as before, but this time instead of a fill color like we did before, let's remove the fill color and add a stroke. And for that stroke, let's use that same color because it makes it stand out. The wireframe itself is pretty gray and pretty boring, and adding those visual overlays like this that are colorful and higher contrast is a nice way to make this section seem more interesting. I'm gonna place the circle to be around the back arrow. And because we will be doing some annotations, let's remove some of the unnecessary screens. Having just 3 is probably gonna be enough, maybe 4. And in this case, we're gonna go with 1 circle or 1 dot per screen. So let's distribute them a little bit more evenly with a little bit of space between them. And then let's add the dots to the next screen. So the next one is gonna be close to the add to bug element. And then the last one is gonna be on call the driver. Because of course we can do it in the exact same spot that we had before, but it might be better to actually differentiate it a little bit. Now this is gonna be a little bit easier because we're gonna go with straight lines just holding the shift key while drawing using the pen tool. Just make sure that the lines you're drawing are parallel to the lines of the actual screens. So the horizontal ones should be aligned to the bottom of the screens and then the vertical one to the sides. Okay, let's add another one that's gonna go between the screens and then simply the vertical line that's a little bit longer so we have enough space here. And then another one. And if you go a little bit too short and you realize you run out of space, you can remove that last point and simply place a new one a little bit further down. And then simply just add another line that's vertical, and we want them to be also pretty evenly distributed, but they don't have to be exactly the same. And in here, just to spice things up, I'm gonna use that marker felt font again, and I'm simply gonna write what this particular icon does, what the action is here. And in this case, it's gonna be back to login. And I'm gonna change the color of that font to the green that we already have and make it a little bit bigger. Now also rotate it 13 degrees because we want that font to be consistent with everything else on that screen. But of course, if you go with a non-rotated version, then it's completely fine. It can be 0 degrees for all of those wireframes. Okay, let's check out here as well. And one thing that's really important is that if you have a vertical line in the font, like the letter T here, it's really good to align it to the line that's actually leading to it from the top. It's gonna be more visible even here. I'm gonna write native phone application, and as you can see, we have the lowercase I here, and I can align it to actually be a continuation of that letter. That's gonna make it all look like it's actually planned, and it's gonna make our brains be a little bit happier. So now let's move this text as well, so the T, the lowercase t, and that vertical part of it is aligned to the line as well. If it looks like a continuation, it simply looks better. And here we are with a couple of simple techniques. We created both hand-drawn or handwritten wireframes using pencil and paper, and we created a very quick version of the digital wireframes by simply modifying and downgrading the fidelity of the high-fidelity designs that we had. If you created more of those low fidelity screens, you can make them smaller on the canvas as well, and then play around with different grids and different connections of the dots and the overlay label elements. But this is a very nice way to make those wireframes, which are normally something people quickly scroll through. Now they look a lot more interesting. Now they look like something that actually took a lot longer than it really did. Play around with these techniques and try to experiment with more of them. You can add circular overlays, you can add charts and graphs next to the wireframes, for example, showing how popular they were in some sort of testing. Just add some extra context elements, but be sure not to add too many of them. So possibly 1 or 2 objects per screen or per wireframe that are some additional annotations or decorations is enough. Wireframes, even if low fidelity, don't have to be ugly and boring. Okay, we're gonna start with the mockups. And of course, for the mockups, you already need to have some created designs. And I have them here in 2 different versions. One is the actual editable screen that I created in the previous course, and the other ones are just PNGs, so exported versions of those screens. This is going to make it a lot easier. I also have an iPhone 13, which is simply a front and center version of like a PNG image that I found in Google image search. You can easily get images like that of all the different phones that you need. We're going to be making mockups and grid views out of the screens that we have. So one thing to remember is that if we have a lot of screens that are similar, for example, the registration or the login process, if you place all of those screens side by side, you're gonna see that it looks very boring and very uniform. And even if you rotate it 13 degrees, which is like the norm to make a beautiful mockup, it still looks boring and bland. So let's revert back, and I'm gonna show you how to distribute the images so it looks better. There is no one perfect way to do this because it all depends on the source images that you have. So you need to play around with this a little bit, and what you need to consider is the image's visual weight. So for example, if we have a huge image of an avocado here, this image, this little screen, is actually visually heavier than, for example, a login screen, which is mostly a white background and some form fields. So you need to distribute them in a way where a heavy screen is next to the lighter one. This is a good exercise of just shuffling your screens like that, just to see if maybe you need another screen to actually make this whole piece look more wholesome. And if not, and if you have at least 2 screens with a form and a lot of screens with a lot more visuals to them, we can create our first mockup. And I'm gonna start by creating a realistic iPhone mockup here. Of course, you can find existing mockups that are already working and easy to use, or you can find the entire libraries or plugins that do this for you automatically. But I want to show you how you can do this on a flat image from scratch, because that allows you to pick any phone that you like. So the first thing that we do is create a rectangle on top of our phone, and we're gonna make it the size of our screen. That requires a little bit of tweaking, and I made this image, the rectangle, transparent a little bit so I can see through it. Now let's bend the corners of it, so I'm gonna round the corners to match the roundness of the iPhone. Now make sure that your shape is exactly the same distance from every edge of the phone, so that black border that we have around the black bezels need to be pretty uniform. And of course you can modify it always at any point. Now we need to create the notch, and the notch is something that is a little bit difficult because of this little area here where it actually has a double roundness. So I'm gonna use the pen tool and just simply click to the second point, and then holding the mouse key I'm gonna bend it a little bit, and then click to the third point and bend it again. And this is a little bit difficult, so you need to play around with this a little bit before you do it, but we're gonna make half the notch only. Now don't worry if you didn't do it perfectly, because I didn't do it perfectly either. You can click on each of the points and actually drag the handles here to modify it and to make it look better. So we need it to be as uniform as possible, so I'm just gonna drag one of the handles a little bit to bend that little bendy thing a little bit more, and it's good enough. Now what we want to do is to remove the stroke and add a fill to it. And this works exactly the same in Sketch and Adobe XD. Now what you need to do is simply flip the image horizontal and place it on the other side. Now that we have the entire notch created, select both the shape and click on this little union icon, which basically looks like 2 overlapping squares. Okay, now we have ourselves a notch. So let's modify the color of our mask here. And I'm gonna change it to something that doesn't hurt the eyes. So for example, a nice blue like this. And what we want to do is to actually use this blue image as a mask for our mockups. And then just to make sure, I'm gonna create some little rectangles or little squares on the sides to make sure that this little blue element is the same distance from every edge. Because we're gonna use this mockup as a template for all the screens that we're gonna do, it's really important to get it right. So just make sure that optically it's aligned to the black bezel around the phone. So in some cases you might have to stretch it out a little bit and just move things around, and yeah, it's looking good. Now let's select both the notch and the blue background, and then go here and subtract selection. It works the same way in Sketch. That basically means that it removes the top shape from the bottom shape. So that gives us a mask with a notch hole basically cut through it. Now let's select both these elements and group them together. There are different ways of doing this. In Figma, you can create a frame of those phone mockups as well. And in Sketch, you can create a symbol this way. But I want to use the simplest possible way because this is not really that important. Okay, the first thing that we want to do is grab one of the screens that we already have and just simply drag it or copy and paste it and drag it on top of our blue mask. So in this case, it's called subtract. The mask itself is called subtract, so I'm just gonna place it on top of the mask. You might want to rearrange the layers, but now what we want to do is to check how big or how wide the blue mask is, and it's 335 in my case. So I'm just gonna select the image, the mockup screen, and then I'm gonna enter that same value. And as you can see, this is exactly the right size now. So now what we want to do is just simply mask this image with the mask that we already created. So on the layer list, I select both the mask and the screen, and simply go into Use as Mask. It works the same way in Sketch, and there's also an icon for it in other design tools, so don't worry if you don't have it in the side menu. Okay, now we have a phone mockup with one of our screens inside it, so let's duplicate it, and then let's grab the second screen. And here's a trick. If you Command click on the Mac or Control click on the mockup inside the mask and then paste in the image, it's gonna paste exactly in place. So now what we want to do is also change the size of it to 335 and simply position it in place. But there is still some things that are not completely right on those screens. Let me explain. If you have rounded buttons, like completely pill-shaped buttons, and you have a rounded cornered mockup or mask, it's really good that the buttons at the bottom, their outline actually kind of flows around the mask, kind of like this. And you can do it in two different ways. First of all, you can modify the screen itself, or in a case like this, when most of the background is a simple color, you can move the screen down a little bit and then simply add a rectangle on the top, still inside the mask. It's gonna make it look a lot better, and if we do it on the second screen, you're gonna notice that it's a little bit more difficult, because if we take that same rectangle and if we draw it here, that background is a lot more difficult to use. So I'm just gonna paste it in to show you. And of course, you can use the color picker. You can zoom in a little bit, and you can use the color picker to pick the color of the top. But in our case, there's actually a gradient that's coming from left to right. So on the right side, the color is not really looking perfect. It really stands out. So there is a couple of things that you can do. And one thing that I almost always do is create a blur to this little rectangle. And you can blur it a little bit more so it actually blends in with the background better. Now I can make it larger to cover the carrot a little bit, and now it looks better, but it's still too visible. To fix that, we're gonna make a gradient out of it. So change the fill into a linear gradient, and of course make it horizontal. And if you want the color to actually be more like a solid color on the side, you don't really need to drag it all the way across to the left and right. So what we want to do is to have both colors be at full opacity, and then simply use the color picker to select the second color on the right. And that blur is actually going to add a little bit more blending to the entire image. And this is how you can easily fix images in the mockup stage without going back to the original projects. This is going to come in handy because in the mockup generation stage, which is what we're doing, we're gonna have a lot of little details to sometimes cover up or modify in the screens, and going back to the individual original screens every time we need to change something is not really a great idea. And besides, in some cases, we only want the changes to happen in the mockups, not in the actual visual screens, because the presentation requires them to be slightly different, but the project doesn't require them to be different. Okay, so let's duplicate this entire mockup again and then copy one of the screens in, click into the mask and then paste it. And then once again, let's change the size of it to 335 and then position it in the top right. So that way the mockup is in the center. And if a mockup doesn't need that additional white element on the top, be sure to remove it. We don't really need any extras once we try setting up the entire grid later. You can also remove the images that are under the main image that you just pasted in inside that mask. So I'm gonna just paste in another image, then change the width of it. And if you place it in the top left corner of the mask and then change the size, then it's gonna align perfectly. We're going to be moving those screens around, but still, for this perfect precision, I'm just gonna align them all perfectly even before we start moving them. So pasting in another screen and fixing it a little bit as well. So just removing the extra images, that's gonna come in handy once the file grows a little bit too big. Okay, duplicating the mockup again, and then I'm gonna grab another screen from the list, and then simply click into the mask and then paste it. And of course, once again, I'm gonna change the width of the file. And in here, I need to place this screen a little bit higher in the mockup. So I'm just gonna move it up a tiny bit. And don't worry if that outline of the mockup itself doesn't perfectly match the rounded button. It doesn't have to be 100% perfect. Of course, if you can make it perfect, it's better that way. But if it's close enough, that's still good, because we're gonna rotate those mockups and we're gonna display a lot of them. So we just don't want big mistakes with alignment and hierarchy and the visual fitting of things together. Okay, time for the last screen. So I'm just gonna copy and paste the entire mockup, make sure that it's aligned to the rest of them, then copy the screen, click into the mask, and then paste it and change the width of it, moving the mask to the top left position. In this mockup, we actually have a pill button at the bottom of it, so we need to move it a little bit down to match it. And of course, make sure that you're only moving the photo, the image inside the mask, and not the mask itself. And we have a similar shape already created for one of the previous screens with the gradient and the blur. So you can just copy that shape, paste it, and then play around with the blur until it matches that new screen. So whenever you can start reusing elements that you already created. Okay, we got 7 phones with 7 different screens inside them. So now let's create a layout for our mockup. I created a new frame and just made it to be 1600 by 1200 in size, but you can use any aspect ratio. So for Instagram, you can go with square. You can use a more kind of 4:3 ratio if you're going to upload a dribble shot. And for most scenarios, a standard almost 16:9 ratio is really good as well. So what I'm starting with is placing the images inside that frame. And of course, some of them are gonna be cut off by the edge of the screen. And if you want them to stay within the boundaries, just make sure that when you drop it, the mouse cursor is actually within the boundaries of the screen. This is how you keep it inside. If it's difficult for you to align them that way, you can always place them inside and then use Shift and the arrow keys to move them manually using the keyboard, and that way they're not gonna get outside of the frame. Now, static grid layouts of phones are boring, and this is not what we want. So we want the phones to be at different heights to make this a little bit more interesting. And of course, make sure that the distances between the phones on every side are exactly the same. So for example, I'm just gonna bring one of those images in the second row a little bit higher up, and then the lower image is gonna be fully visible, the one with the tab bar. Then of course the third row doesn't have to be exactly as the first one. To make it interesting, you can have like a completely different setting here. So as long as the phones are the same distance from each other, the more random looking the grid, the better. Remember what I said about visual weight? Exactly. This is why we want to distribute the screens one more time a little bit better. So for example, that avocado screen is one of the nicer looking screens because it has more of a visual. So you can actually show more of it and show more of it towards the center of the entire mockup. Then I can bring the login screen next to it because it's actually fairly simple in terms of the visuals. So it's not that overwhelming, and it actually matches the heavy screen with the light screen. Now, of course, this takes a lot of getting used to, and you can take inspiration from popular dribble shots and other mockups that you find. You can see how people match screens together in a nice looking way. But definitely don't place the login and the registration close to one another on the mockup, because this is gonna be a spot that is visually lighter than the more visually advanced screens that are next to it. We want this entire composition to be as balanced as possible. And of course, if you have one missing screen, like in my case, you can take one of the screens that is cut off by the display of the frame the most. In my case, it's gonna be the round map screen. And simply, since I only see the bottom part on the second column on the top, then I can use the top part on the right side. Okay, now let's make some alignments here. So I'm just gonna create a square. And I'm gonna keep it at 56 or 58, a little bit like that, and I'm gonna make it red. The actual size of that square doesn't really matter as long as it's the same, but if we're gonna be using shadows in our mockups, it's actually good that that distance is not really small. So don't use a distance between the phones like 16 or 32. I think something above 50 is generally a good idea with a lot of phones. And now simply align those phones to that square. The most important distance is between the phones. That distance has to be the same. Of course, if you want, you can always use that same distance from the edge of the screen to the phone, like in this case. So I can grab that little square and move it to the bottom of the screen, then select both those mockups and move them up. But it's not necessary. That distance from the bottom can actually be different than the distance between the phones because there is only white space down there. But just make sure, and this is really important for the overall composition, that the distances are the same. And you can skip things like the volume buttons here. They don't really count as optically heavy enough to be counted in the alignment. But the distances vertically and horizontally have to be the same. So I'm just aligning it to the frame. But you also need to be aware of the internal distance of things within the actual mockups. As you can see, the delivery in progress text, if it's aligned like this, doesn't really look exactly centered. So we need to move it up. And of course, if there's something below it, you can't have like a couple of pixels sticking out from the bottom. So in this case, just place it vertically to be as visible as possible. Okay, now let's align the rest of the phones. So I'm gonna grab the helper square and I'm just gonna place it on the side of the phone. Just make sure that it actually touches the light gray border of the phone and not the black bezel, and then simply move the next row of the phones together. Now we can actually use the same technique from the top, but it's not necessary, as I said. You can have a smaller distance from the top as well if there is no screen on the top, and it can be half the size of that main distance if you want it to still be uniform, or it can be almost random. Just don't have the phone too close to the edge. Okay, we can now take out those helper squares from the sides, and we have ourselves a standard mockup. It looks pretty good, but of course it can look better. What we want is a little bit more space on the sides, so I'm just gonna increase the width of this element and simply select everything and place it in the center. Now it has a lot more breathing space and it just simply looks better. Now we're gonna change this name to option 1 because this is gonna be just the first very simple iteration of what we're doing. I noticed that on one of the screens in the flow we have a very nice Aurora-like background. So I'm just simply gonna select the group with the background, select the export option and export it at about 5x. And of course you can then export it to desktop and just call it anything. Now simply drag the image from the desktop to your computer, and once we have that background, it's gonna make it easier to work with the mockups. Because if we went with those initial shapes that had a blur applied to them, changing the size of everything and rotating it could require you to adjust them every single time. So I'm just gonna place it in the background of our shapes, just under all of the phones, and simply play around with the opacity. We don't really want the background to be too strong. Remember this one thing, the best mockups, the best visuals are subtle because they don't take the attention away from the screens themselves. To give our mockups a little bit more depth, we're gonna add some shadows to them. And of course, the obvious technique would be to select that group and add a shadow to them. And here, the rule of mostly using the y-axis doesn't apply. The best looking shadows are actually both the y and the x-axis at around the same distance. I'm gonna go with 24 and a pretty heavy blur. And for the shadow color, I'm gonna select the saturated darker shade of the green that I'm using in this app. That's gonna make it fit and match the entire style of it. Then we can increase or decrease the blur, but we want that shadow to be barely visible. We don't want it to be too hard on the eyes. Because if we had a very strong shadow like this, first of all, it's gonna look very weird on the edge of the phone. And second of all, it's gonna make that screen actually a little bit less impactful. So the shadows should be very, very background decoration. And what we can do here, instead of using a shadow like that, to have a little bit more control over everything, is to actually create a rectangle ourselves and then make the corner radius that's matching the corner radius of the phone, And now we can modify the color of it to pick a color from the green, then play around with the saturating it and making it darker. So we want to have a pretty dark color, not too dark, and this is going to be our shadow. And that gives us more flexibility than the standard shadow because we can modify it, tilt it if we need it, and just play around with it in a lot of different ways. So I'm adding a blur to it, and we don't want the blur to be too high because that way you're not gonna see the shadow, and we don't want it too low because it's gonna look too hard on the edges. So the best way to try it is to actually place it at a 45-degree angle off the center of the phone. So basically move it a little bit to the right and to the bottom, kind of like this. And this is a good position, but we need to decrease the opacity so the shadow is not as hard on the eyes. If you want, you can place the shadow on the y-axis, so it's basically sticking out from the bottom of the phone, but generally those mockups really look better if the shadow is both to the right and to the bottom. So I'm just simply duplicating the object and then placing it under all of the other phones. And don't worry if that shadow is not exactly the same distance from every phone. As long as it's close enough, nobody's gonna notice, and you can do that pretty quickly. So simply duplicate it, move it again, and be sure to remember the name of the actual layer because we will be modifying all of those shadow layers at the same time. And if you're using realistic phone mockups like we are here, you don't even need the shadow if it clashes with the actual style of the object. And now we can add a little bit of decoration, just not too much. So I grabbed the leaf that I had as one of the overlays on the dashboard screen, and I simply pasted it in here. And I made it bigger and I made it sticking out from the edge of the phone a little bit because that's the best way to actually decorate. Then decrease the opacity of the shadow a little bit. And notice that I didn't really remove that same leaf from the actual phone mockup. I simply made this one bigger and covered it. We don't want parts of the other leaf sticking out from under the additional decorative one, so just one is actually enough. If you're gonna do decorations, you don't really need to add a lot of elements. So let's try something different now. Let's duplicate this entire artboard, and I'm gonna start by selecting all of the shadow rectangles that are on that frame and decreasing their opacity to like 30. And you can decrease them further, or if you didn't do the shadows, you can just leave it as it is. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select both the shadows and the phone mockups and group them all together. Now here is a thing you can do. There is this rule of rotating elements by between 12 and 15 degrees that makes it basically instantly look better. The reason for that is that when we rotate it between those 12 and 15 degrees, it's simply a lot tougher for our brain to process any alignment issues or visual problems. It actually makes it easier for it to process, easier to scan, and instantly makes it look better, even if the initial design is not perfect. I almost always go with 13% though, because I think it looks the best. Now what we want to do is to move the elements a little bit to the side, because if we do have like a diagonal direction of the screens, it's really good to leave a little bit of white space on one of the sides to actually look like it's naturally flowing. So I'm just gonna move it to the right like this. And you can leave this little space on the top left here, and you can use that, for example, to add a logo of your project, or just keep it empty to make it a little bit more interesting visually. Notice how the same screen of that little circular map is actually both on the top and near the bottom, as we're only showing a little part of it, and then the part of the map doesn't have the rest with the text. Now we can duplicate some of the screens that are either cut off by the visuals or aren't really that important, and just place them on the sides to make it a little bit more visually dense, because we're gonna leave that top left completely empty, but it's really good to fill the remaining space with screens. In a case like this, when there is a screen that's pretty much almost completely invisible, it really doesn't matter which one you choose, but try to choose one that doesn't instantly look like it's the same screen that's next to it and just copy it over. So it's really good to actually pick a screen that's different. That's why I'm gonna pick this one. It has photo thumbnails on the left edge, so it's gonna make those little edge elements a little bit more prominent. And of course, I'm gonna place it at the exact same distance from all the other screens. Okay, now let's duplicate this entire frame again, and let's play with some different backgrounds, because I want to truly emphasize this. If you're gonna do a background that's really hard in colors, like very saturated and very dark, for most types of screens, it's not gonna look good unless you're working with dark mode. So let's add a linear gradient to the back of the frame. And for now, let's pick a pretty dark gradient from one of our green colors to the other, the saturated green that we have on the screen as well. Well, it might be questionable as, people are different and have different tastes. I don't believe that this kind of presentation is going to look good in your case study or in your portfolio. In most cases, it just looks a little bit too busy and it's really a lot more difficult to pull off a harder background like this. So decrease the opacity of it or just remove it completely, because if you do have shadows already and if you have some nice overlays like the leaf that we have, a white background is going to be just fine. It's all about the screens, not the background. Remember that the screens are what you're showing and promoting. So the background needs to be in the back. If you have a pretty dense grid like we have here, it's really good not to use too many visual elements like the leaf that we have on the top left. In most cases, one is enough, but you can try with another leaf, for example, like in my case, and place it behind the phones to add a little bit more depth to the entire mockup. But remember to place it in a way that it complements the phones and also that it's visible what it is. Because if you hide most of it under the phones and then have just a tiny bit of green sticking out, nobody's gonna know what that is. So it's really good to make the leaf stand out for what it is, and that's why I'm actually gonna leave that stem here as well. And I'm gonna add a little bit of a shadow here. So this is an option potentially worth trying, but I'm not a fan of it. I really like those mockups to be as minimal as possible because it really should be all about the screens and not the decoration. So I still think that the one with just one leaf actually looks better. But if you want to place another one, also make sure to distribute it around the screen so it's not really close to the very first one. Okay, let's duplicate the screen again and let's try something else. For this version, I'm gonna remove the two screens on the sides, the ones that we added at the later stage. So that's gonna leave the main grid that we have and a little bit of space on the sides. So now let's create a circle and add a stroke to it. And for that stroke, I'm gonna pick the green color that we use in the app itself. And I'm gonna make this stroke a little bit thicker. And anything above like 10 points should be okay. It's really good to have thicker lines because they simply complement phones a little bit better. And then I'm gonna drag this layer on the bottom of the layer list so it's under the phones. Now we can make this entire circle larger and move it around a little bit, but remember to actually enlarge it in a way where it doesn't really stick just a couple of pixels outside of phones. So it needs to pretty much go through the actual mockups. I also made the stroke a little bit thicker because of the style of this app, and I duplicated it and moved the copy to the right side of the screen, and this time to the top right side of the screen. Of course, that circle can't really be the exact same size, so I'm just gonna decrease the size first. It's gonna be smaller. And then for the color of it, I'm gonna use the second desaturated green that I used in my app, but of course make sure to use the color from your project. You can duplicate one of the circles again and make like a very, very small copy of it and then place that copy somewhere around the white space, kind of like this. Of course, this is not necessary, but this can look pretty nice. And of course, you can then duplicate this again and place it somewhere on the other side and maybe make it a little bit bigger, enlarge the border thickness and make the border the same color as the outer circle. Of course, you can also mix and match them. With two big ones and two smaller ones, this is pretty okay. But when you're positioning the circles, it's really important to actually have enough of them to be visible. Because if you place them in a way where there's only a part of it, like a couple of pixels, visible from either the side of the screen or from under the phones, it's not gonna look good. It's really good if those lines actually go through the actual phones. as much as possible. Now I pasted in an onboarding process with a slightly different idea, and if you have an onboarding process with shapes that are a very important part of the design like those three, you can actually use it to your advantage while presenting the work. So I duplicated one of those frames, and of course we're only gonna need 3 images here. So we don't need the background shapes, and we don't need most of the mockups, and of course we don't need their shadows either. So just select everything and then just remove it. So removing everything, we're gonna be left with just 3 mockups. And of course we need to move those mockups so they are visible. So I'm just gonna move them all side by side, and for this we're not gonna use the rotation. So I'm just gonna select the entire group and change the rotation back to 0. For now, try to distribute the images to be roughly evenly placed, so at the same height and roughly the same distance from each other, and then in the center of the screen. But of course, we're gonna have to modify it a little bit. So first I'm gonna select the first image and then simply paste it in. Now, once again, let's change the size of it to 335 and of course position it in the very top left corner. That way, when we shrink it, it actually becomes the right size. And of course, once again, I'm gonna move this down a little bit so the buttons, the roundness of the buttons actually match the roundness of the mockup, and then add a rectangle within the mask that's the same color as the top of the screen. Okay, now it's time to paste in the next screen in the series. So I'm just gonna select it, copy, then paste it, then again 335 as the size, then place it in the right spot, and then we can simply copy that shape that we already had, click into the mask and paste it. And then the last screen, the same thing, clicking into the mask, 335 in my case, but of course in your case it can be different, and then simply move it onto the right spot. And as you can see, the direction of these elements is actually not right, because this screen that is number 3 here is actually the very first one. So I'm gonna first fix the top part of it. So just simply gonna copy that little shape, overlay shape that we had, add a layer blur to it so it doesn't really cut off the leaf as much, and increase the blur value. And of course I can actually drag it down a little bit as well. Now that we have that shape, we can copy it and then paste it into the mask on the third screen. And of course, what we have to do now is actually to drag this entire mockup, the third mockup, to be in the front, because this is how that shape in the background of those phones is actually flowing. And now move everything to the center. Now, because that shape is diagonal, I'm gonna actually move the phones up and down a little bit so that the line between those green elements actually seems to be flowing through the phones. Don't worry that the phones are at different heights. If this is intentional, that's more than okay. And of course, let's place them exactly in the center, and I'm gonna go back to my mockup screens that I created, and I'm gonna select the image that I used for that shape. And then I'm gonna go back into the mockup and then paste it in. And now let's try to align it perfectly on top of our images. You can reduce the opacity of that shape so you'll be able to actually see where they are, and then simply drag one of the edges of it and enlarge it to be coming out of the screen completely on one side, like this. Now it's all about getting this perfect. So first of all, I'm gonna start by aligning the screens as much as I can, but then we can play around with the rotation of the actual shape so it matches that diagonal line going through the screens as much as possible. So in some cases, you might need to move the screen up or down a little bit if you're also having a diagonal line. Or you can make a tiny like fraction size rotation here. So I'm just gonna play with like 14.5 or maybe 14.9, things like that. And it's really important to get it as close to perfect as possible. And even if it can't be completely perfect, that's completely fine. You just need to get it as close to perfect as possible for this effect to work. So I zoomed in and found a rotation that I think works with a couple of tweaks, and then it's all about moving the images still. This effect takes a while, but it's really worth it. So I'm just gonna get the change again. 14.9 seems almost perfect, and now it's time to just drag the actual screens, the actual mockups, and move them around a bit. And once they are almost in place, you can then adjust the additional ones if they need adjusting, like the third one here is a little bit too high. And it's starting to look good. In most cases, because of the mockups themselves and the distance between the mockups, it's actually not that easy to align it completely perfectly. But now what we want to do is to actually drag the element that we just created to the back, so behind the phones, and then bring the opacity back up. And as you can see, you have a very nice way of the phones, the mockups, and the background merging together and looking actually pretty good because of that combination of both minimal and the dark color in the background. So if your screens have any shapes that are kind of sticking out from the phone, you can then continue those shapes in the background of the mockup. This is a very nice way of having like a coherent vision for the product. And of course, you can also duplicate this element if you want and add it like another diagonal line on the bottom. And this time it doesn't really matter if it doesn't have a reflection in the phones. So you can actually even place it under the phones kind of like this from the bottom, and that should be fine as well. So just move it around until you find something that feels right. And if just one of them has this overlapping merging effect like the top one, the bottom one really doesn't have to. But in my case, I think I prefer it to actually not be that prominent. So I'm just gonna place it a little bit lower and diagonally so it doesn't even touch the phones. Something like this can work as well. Okay, so this is another version. And overlaps like this with the part of the mockup and part of the background merging are a great way to explore further. Okay, we're gonna make another one soon, so I'm just gonna move the screenshots that we had of this new onboarding flow close to all the other screenshots. Okay, now let's duplicate this option 5 that we had because it only has 3 screens, and I want to show you a couple of more options that you can use instead of using the iPhones. So I'm just gonna drag option 6 to the bottom because it's gonna be a different style completely. So in here, I'm just gonna remove everything and we're gonna make a new mockup from scratch. I'll start by selecting a screen that I want to use for the mockup and simply dragging it to the artboard. And I can place it in the center, but it doesn't really matter because we're gonna move it anyway. And now let's draw a rectangle on top of it. Don't worry about the size just yet because we're gonna adjust it. We want that rectangle to be under the screenshot on the layer list, like this. So just swap them if you have to, and then place one on top of the other. Now what we want is to have the same distance from every direction. So we have like 18 and 17. I'm gonna go with 16 on every side, but you can use mockups that are slightly larger as well. So you can try to go with 20 or possibly 24. If you go with even larger, it's gonna look a little bit grotesque. So what I want here is to have those 16 points from every side. If your mockup has like a fraction of a point added to the height or width of it, you can then modify it manually to just switch it to like a full number. Okay, now I adjusted the size of the rectangle in the background, so it's exactly 16 points in every direction. This is what we want. Now let's round the corners, and generally if you're using mockups that are minimal like this, it's pretty good to have the corners quite rounded, so don't go with like barely rounded. But of course, if you use that same value of 40, for example, on both of the elements, you'll see that the edge doesn't look great. We need to adjust the inner border radius of the actual screenshot to match the border radius of the outside, like this. It has to be an even line going around of it. And also don't really experiment with colors of that frame. It's best to keep it white, or if you're using a dark mode screen, then you can turn it to like a darker gray. But of course, if it's white and the background is white, then it makes the frame invisible, so let's add a shadow to it. And once again, I'm gonna add the same number on the X and the Y axis, and then a much larger number for the blur. If the blur value is at least double that of the X and Y, then the shadow is actually gonna spread on all the sides, making this entire white background completely visible. And we can modify the color of the shadow to be a dark hue, but still from within the palette of the app, which is a little bit into the green. Okay, so this is it. We have a nice minimal mockup. I'm gonna move it to the left side of the screen and then duplicate it so we'll have 3 screens in that style next to one another. So first let's add another screen into the mockup. Now in this case we're not using a mask, but of course if you can't round the corners of the actual image, for example, you might want to use a mask inside. Simply make another rectangle inside the main white rectangle and do the exact same steps that we did with the actual iPhones. Just make sure that the image in the center is exactly centered both horizontally and vertically, and then we can duplicate it one more time to have the third screen. Okay, for the third screen, I'm gonna go with something simple like a login screen and then simply paste it inside the mockup, and then make sure to modify the corner radius of this element or of the mask if you have a mask there to match the corner radius of the inside of the mockup. Now we can select all 3 of them or just space them out a little bit more. And especially if you have larger shadows like this, it's good to have a lot of spacing between those phones. And now you can place them at slightly different heights to actually make it look more interesting. You can use a square again to calculate it from the distance between the phones, or you can do it by eye. So in this case, I want the top edge of the phone to be as far from the top edge of the screen as the phones are from one another, and then the bottommost part of the screen, the very first one, also at the same distance. Then the third screen can be at a completely different height. Okay, let's duplicate this minimal frame and let's play with it some more. So let's go with the 13 degrees rotation for all of those phones. Once you rotate all 3 of them, you can then distribute them a little bit more evenly. So in this case, I'm gonna move the middle screen down a little bit, and then I'm gonna move the right screen up a little bit. And of course, this is not really enough, especially in that diagonal position. So we can move all of them a little bit, but then we can duplicate the entire mockup and then move it down to fill the space. To not slow you down, I'm gonna use the same screenshots that I have on this mockup, but of course you can do it the same way as we did with the realistic iPhones. So you can have different screenshots in all of the screens. So just copy and paste those mockups and then distribute them, and remember that the distances between the phones have to be the same. So just fill in a little bit more space. It doesn't have to be completely crowded in every direction. And as I said, it's really good to have one side or the top left part actually a little bit more open. But still, as much as you can, fill the space to show that you created a lot of screens, because this is what recruiters are looking for. They want to see that you did a lot of work. So in this case, we're gonna have a lot of screens like this, and I'm gonna duplicate this one. And this is a very interesting thing, because if we zoom in a little bit, you're gonna notice that there is a little bit of an arrow sticking out from the outside of the screen. And partial objects like that make the design look messy. So in this case, we can completely hide it. Just create an oval and then pick the color of the oval, the fill color, from the background so it's not visible. And in cases like this, when there is just a tiny bit of an element sticking out from outside the screen, it's really good to just cover it up. Okay, so a 16-point white frame with a shadow is a pretty nice minimal way to showcase your mockups. But you can go even more minimal. So let's remove all the frames that we have here and just leave the screenshots themselves. Of course, they don't have a shadow now, and they're not really sticking out from the background too much, especially if there is a lot of white like on the screen in the top. So after removing the white border frame from all of them, select everything, so all the screens that you have, and we can add a shadow to them so they're gonna be more visible on that light background. So I'm just simply gonna add a drop shadow, and make sure that you don't select little objects on top of the screen. So add a drop shadow, and I'm gonna go with 16 for X and Y, because this is, I think, a pretty good value for most mockups, and generally the blur value should be at least double, but in case of mockups it's actually good to go with like quadruple. So in this case I'm gonna go with 64. And now we have like super minimal mockups that are looking pretty good in terms of the visual, and they're not really overwhelming as well. But if you don't have the mockups, it's really good to actually increase the roundness of the corners. So in our case, let's increase them to like 52 or something like this. But the number is actually varied, and it really depends on what your screenshots look like. If it's more rounded, it simply looks more pleasant. And of course, in this case, you can clearly see that we didn't place the buttons in the proper position here because they should be a little bit lower to actually match the roundness better. So in a case like this, if we don't have a mask, we can't really fix it. So it probably would be better if we could go back to the actual screen and then modify it that way. And just to have a nice touch, I'm gonna paste that leaf again and make it larger and then cover the leaf that we had on the main screen. And then we can also paste it on this screen too. And I'm gonna repeat it again because this is super important. If you're gonna add decoration, the more you add, the more cluttered and busy the design becomes, and it doesn't really promote the actual screenshots. What you want to have is that the screenshots are the actual important element here, not the decoration, not the backgrounds. So you need to be subtle and you need to be pretty minimal with that. Okay, now let's duplicate the first minimal option and let's create ourselves some clay mockups. If you want, you can also download the clay mockup set that we created from the course files, but it's really good to actually understand how they're made. So let's add another effect to it, but this time we want an inner shadow. We are going to add 2 inner shadows to this shape as well. So first is going to be a lighter inner shadow. So for now you can use any color or you can pick a lighter hue from the greens. It's going to be almost white anyway. So something like this. This shadow also needs to have the same values for X and Y, but this time I'm gonna go with 4. And to make it more visible, I made it darker for a second so you can see. We want it to be in the top and the left side of the screen. And then you can drag the color slider a little bit. The blur shouldn't be too big, so 8 is possibly the maximum here, because if it's too big, it's not gonna be visible. You can also try to add a tiny hint of the primary main color, which is like a light green, to the background of our shape. That's gonna make the top inner shadow actually more visible. Now let's add another inner shadow to the mix, and this one is gonna be on the bottom right, so we need negative values for both X and Y, and then the blur should be the same. And this is a little bit too strong, so first of all pick a color that's coming from our green, and it has to be light enough so it's still visible, and you can then decrease the opacity a little bit. As you can see, this adds this little 3D effect of like a plastic clay-like structure to the mockups. And this can look quite nice in some cases. So let's simply grab the object and then go to copy the properties or copy the style in Sketch and then simply paste the properties or paste the style onto the other two. Once you have a lot of different options and you like one particular decoration like the leaf here, you can then go to an option where you didn't paste it and then paste it in to just see how it will look like. And I really like it because it's a very subtle, nice little touch. It doesn't overwhelm the image, it just adds to it, and this is what we want. If you don't like the minimal background and your app uses like a very light Aurora style background, you can copy it from one of the examples above and then simply paste it underneath the screenshots. And if you do have a background that's a little bit darker than white, then you can decrease the opacity or the blur of our shadows. It can be a little bit lighter, or it can actually be coming from our main green color as well. We want it to blend in better with the background. So if the shadow is being cast on a white surface, it actually can be more gray than green in our case. But if the surface underneath the shadow is more colorful, it's really good for the shadow to reflect that. Okay, I like that particular frame, so I'm just gonna duplicate it, and then let's go to our main screenshots, and I'm gonna grab the entire section from the bottom here, which is basically a similar products group. I'm gonna select them all, copy, and then go onto our mockup, and then simply paste them on the top. And as you can see, I did some tricks there for the carrot to be still visible, even though it would probably be just behind the screen. So I moved it to the left along with the label for it. So right now we want to move it exactly where it should be, so more to the center. And the carrot also doesn't have a nice blurry shadow, so I'm just gonna enlarge it a little bit, duplicate the object itself, and then add a layer blur to it. The blur doesn't have to be too big. It can be like just a couple points, maybe like 14 or 15. And then if it's underneath the carrot, you can just move it down a little bit so it's more visible. The problem with this is that we can still see a little bit of the stem of the pepper and stem of the carrot behind there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new rectangle with the same corner radius as the inside of the frame, change it to white, and then drag it on top of the actual image. That way we will cover that stem of the carrot and the stem of the pepper in my case. So this is gonna leave just the top layer, which is what we want. And this style of illustration is actually quite popular with many mockups. You can have them sticking out of the frame, and that adds depth and that adds a little bit of more creative effect and creative feel to the project. But as with everything, remember not to overdo it. It's really good to have one or two things like that sticking out so much from the frame in one particular presentation. If you have more, then it can be just too crowded. And to show you another idea that's slightly bigger, I'm gonna go to our list of screenshots and I'm gonna pick the delivery with the map, because that allows us to actually break down the map away from the information below it. So I'm just gonna replace one of the screens here with that. And I'm gonna go with the screen on the left. Sure, it's pretty visual, but I think we can do something more interesting without it. Okay, so pasted in the screen onto the phone. And the next thing that we want to do is that we have a card from the bottom. It's called an action sheet. And we want that action sheet to actually be outside of the frame of the phone. So I'm gonna go to that screen where I can actually have this entire object, and I'm gonna select everything. So just drag and select, and of course just click on the map if you don't want it. I don't want it. Then I'm gonna group it and go back to the mockup. And then clicking on top of it, I'm gonna paste that whole selection. And I'm gonna place it on top of everything. There are a couple of ways of doing this. One is to actually make this object be the right size. So of course make it a little bit shorter and a little bit wider, and then export it as a graphics, make it larger, and then place it on top of the mockup. But I'm gonna go with a simpler option that doesn't require exporting it. So I'm just simply gonna make it a little bit wider than the frame. And of course that empty space on the bottom has to go as well. So now once we have it slightly more proportional, you can try to play around with the position of it to be actually covering up the entire thing. We don't want part of that white background sticking out from below. And of course that overlay doesn't have to be completely centered. It can be a little bit to the side like our similar products too. It's all up to you how you position it. Now let's create some more decorations. So I'm just gonna grab the rectangle from under our green apple here, and it already has a shadow, so I'm gonna make it into a square. And I want it to be like 60 by 60, not really a big one. And then place it somewhere next to the phones. We don't want too many of those, so just try to distribute them pretty evenly, and then I'm gonna make another one that's 90 by 90. It's good to have them a little bit more proportional. Then let's go to one of our screens, and because this app is about e-commerce, you can either grab the logo of the app, which is the leaf, or we can go into the shopping bag icon. So I'm just gonna select the bag, copy it, and then go back to the screen, click onto our smaller square, and then simply paste it. That will add an additional decorative element that actually is connected to the actual app. Generally, we don't mix and match outline icons like the shopping bag with filled icons like this little pin here, but in a case of mockups and presentations, it actually can work. So I'm just gonna grab that little pin, and because it's a larger icon, I'm gonna paste it onto the larger square. This shows that the app is a mix of shopping and location, and it actually brings it a little bit more to life. Now I'm gonna grab the smaller square and I'm gonna duplicate it and move it to the right side of the screen. It's really good to have it distributed as evenly as possible. So in my case, they're gonna form sort of like a triangle, and it usually works best if it's done that way. So I'm gonna grab one more icon, and this time I'm gonna go with the heart icon, which is the add to favorites. And the heart icon and the star icon are actually very popular in mockups because they fit pretty much almost every possible project. So if you don't even have any icons on the screens, it's pretty safe to go with a heart icon or a star icon anyway as those little decorative elements. And I noticed a couple of things still. First of all, the shadow under delivery in progress is different. It's darker than the shadow we have under the mockups. So go into the mockups and then simply copy the properties or copy the layer style in Sketch and then simply paste it onto that little card. and now it matches it a lot better. You can try to place it a little bit more to the side if you like as well. The important thing to remember is to never have the original part of that image still being visible from underneath. So it has to cover the entire thing. Something like this is unacceptable. The whole fun is in playing around, moving stuff around, and just seeing which version looks better to you. And if it's subtle and if there's not too many overlapping elements, it's still gonna be good. But just as the actual UI elements can be brought forward and overlap the mockups, you can also use the decorations that way. But it's really important that if you have a rectangular decoration like this, to not have it exactly even with the form field, for example, because this is gonna make it look weird. It has to be a little bit off, a little bit more organic and naturally placed. This is why I moved it a little bit lower. Okay, now let's make one more version of this. So I'm just gonna duplicate option 10, and we're gonna make a version with those circles in the background, but also with those overlapping elements. So once I have the duplicate, I'm gonna go into the screen where we had those circles. I'm gonna click and select with Shift key all of them, and then simply I'm gonna copy them, click onto the background and paste them. And now we need to move them around a little bit. Just the same way, because we only have 3 screens here, it needs to show that they're going through all of the screens. So if you move one of the circles like this and there's only like a tiny fraction of it sticking from outside of the screen, it's bad. We want them to be going through the screens, and through the screens not really close to their corners. So something like this is something that works. And once we already have a background that's pretty busy like this, we don't really need an additional color either. So now the only thing here is to actually move this out of the way, because currently it kind of breaks this line in half. So we want to move this whole object, this whole decoration, so it overlaps the line like this. And it actually starts looking a lot better instantly. I purposefully omitted one thing just to show you. I didn't change the corner radius on this mockup. So something very small and barely noticeable, but it actually does make a difference. So before you export the final images of your mockups, of your final UI presentations, always make sure to check if everything is rounded correctly, if everything is overlapping correctly, if the shadows are the right color, matching the background, if they're not too dark or too light. So checking things like that is really important. And we're gonna make one more variation. So I'm just gonna copy option 7 here and create option 12. Now let's zoom into it and let's make one big change here. And by big I mean literally. We wanna make this one screen bigger than the others. So first thing that we want to do is to grab the entire group and make sure that the scaling is locked to be proportional, and then simply enter a larger number for the width. I'm gonna go with 500, and then I can move it a little bit higher. So the first thing that you need to do here is to align it in a way that it doesn't overlap other screens. I know that some designers do it this way, but it's way more difficult. So if you're just starting out your UI presentations, avoid overlapping of the screens because it's really easy to make it worse. Okay, now I'm gonna move one of the remaining screens under it, and of course I'm using the same screens over and over in this example, but for your real mockups, make sure that every screen is different. Okay, we made one screen larger, so let's make the other one smaller. Make sure the proportions are locked and then enter a smaller number. We don't want to go too far, so usually about 50 or 60 points wider in every direction. So this one is just gonna be smaller that way. And then I'm gonna bring the rest of the screens closer again, just making sure that I also get that little overlay that we created to cover up the arrow. Some small alignment tweaks, and then let's duplicate that small screen because obviously it doesn't take up the entire screen real estate, and I'm gonna move the copy of it upwards so it can actually stick outside of the screen a little bit like this. Now I'm making some quick spacing adjustments just to make sure that everything is right and removing some of the screens and then zooming out to see how it looks like from the top. And also filling in the space for the smaller phones to also have something underneath them. Okay, now we have a grid of 3 phone sizes, large, medium, and small. But the difference is that if something is large, that means that it's closer to you. That also means that it's casting a different kind of shadow. So first of all, I'm gonna actually decrease the size of the mockup inside that phone, because if it's closer to you, then the frames can actually also be a little bit larger. Because I changed the size, I also have to zoom in a little bit and modify the corner radius, because right now it doesn't match. So if you increase it, it actually starts not matching, but if you decrease it a little bit like this, now that white line going around the mockup looks good. It looks even in every direction. Okay, but because it's closer, we actually want this object to cast a larger shadow. We can go with a slightly larger blur, but it's already pretty big, so I'm gonna increase the X and Y values and also increase the opacity a little bit so it's a little bit more visible. And now that shadow looks better than the other ones, but because this is the topmost layer, make sure that it's also at the top of the layer list. So it's casting a little bit of that shadow onto the screens on the right. And because of that hierarchy, we can actually bring them closer together a little bit. Just don't overdo it. Don't have them practically touching, because that wouldn't really work great either. But if you have depth, then you can actually make those spaces a little bit smaller. Now let's select all of the smaller phones, just the backgrounds, and then once they're all selected, let's decrease the shadow opacity of them, because if the main one is casting the largest shadow, then these should be basically a little bit less blurry and probably a little bit lower opacity as well. I'm gonna go down from 25 to about 15. And now we have depth. We now have different layers that are completely visible. And you can use those principles for different elements and for decorations as well. Now you can select everything and move it around the frame a little bit just to make sure that it's the best possible look. And that's it. We created a couple of different ways to showcase our screens in a grid of mockups. This is one of the best ways for junior designers to show their work because it shows that you created a lot of screens. The main takeaway is to keep it subtle. If your screens are not in dark mode, avoid darker, more saturated backgrounds. Keep it simple, keep it white or barely visible background because the screens are what matters. Once you progress with your design skills, you'll be able to actually go even further with those mockups, but for now, it's best to stay safe. The techniques that I showed you are safe. That means that they allow you to present your work with the least possibility of failure or actually making a chaotic, messy design. So it's a start, and I encourage you to explore it further.
Well, you've gotten to the end. Congratulations. I'm sharing everything that I'm doing, all of my methods, documents, and templates in the Squareblack Blueprint, which is my best work to date, and it includes a community of people who have direct access to me, meaning once a week I answer all your questions related to handling clients, getting new clients, and growing your business or freelance. And this is an opportunity that is unlike any other because you don't really usually get access to somebody with 26 years of experience. So if you've gotten this far, it means that you're invested in your future and in your career. Take it one step forward, get the Squareblack Blueprint with the link in the description. There's still a discount available. And remember, 1000 likes and 300 comments from different people, and make those comments count and not just write a single line that it's nice, because those are not going to be counted. Write what you got from this course, what you feel like you still need to understand, what are your questions and what are your assumptions, and maybe what parts of it you've already been doing. Be creative. And obviously, have a beautiful day.